Today on Brief History, we look into the history surrounding perhaps the most famous and influential person to ever walk the earth. There are few, if any, other people who have had the impact that this man and his message has had on the world. His life was marked by persecution, prophetic teaching, moral condemnation, bloody execution, and a divine claim that changed the trajectory of the world. Join me as I take a brief look into the life and legacy of Jesus of Nazareth, known today as Jesus Christ. Hello and welcome to Brief History. So before we get into the life of Jesus, there are a few housekeeping things that need to be addressed and some disclaimers that need to be made before we get into the discussion. First off, it is important that the purpose of this video be clearly stated, and I want to get immediately to the point. Although we will discuss this much more throughout the video, it is important to note that Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be divine, or God, if you will. The purpose of this video is not to determine whether these claims are true or not. Although there have been many who have contested or denied Jesus' claims, few scholars deny that Jesus was actually a real person in history. Therefore, there is a historical story to be told. This video is intended to give some historical context to Jesus' life and ministry from a Christian perspective. It is also intended to give some perspective to the famous biblical characters that many in society may know or may have heard of, but may not know much about, for instance, Moses or Abraham, and why they are important to the grand scheme. It is also the intention of the video to give the overarching story of the Bible in a quick and straightforward manner. However, it must be understood that from a Christian perspective, Jesus Christ, being part of the divine Trinity, something we will discuss in the video, is eternal. Therefore, the story of Jesus is not just the story of his life as he lived it on earth. Instead, the thousands of years of Jewish religious and secular history must be discussed in order to give context to what it was that Jesus was doing and why he was doing it. Due to this, we will be going through the overarching storyline of the thousands of years of history leading up to Jesus' life as laid out in the Old Testament, albeit briefly. This video may be long from a YouTube standpoint, but again, one must realize that the story of Jesus includes the story of the ancient Jewish religion, and the ancient Jewish religion and society was affected by and was contemporary to many well-known and powerful ancient civilizations throughout the centuries. It must be understood that the discussion of these various civilizations and the different characters as laid out in the Old and New Testaments in the Bible that we will discuss all have their own respective deep rabbit holes of information that could not realistically all be fit into one video. So although we will touch on the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Persians, the Egyptians, and the Romans, as well as Moses, Abraham, King David, King Solomon, the prophets, the 12 disciples, the Apostle Paul, etc., the discussion of these civilizations and people are all going to be limited and streamlined. There will be aspects of these civilizations or events in these people's lives that will not be discussed in this video, but that does not mean that what may be left out of this video is not important or is less valuable. Along those same lines, one must understand that the Bible and the message of Jesus is full of lessons and guidance, truth claims, theology, and spirituality, and these things are not intended to be the focus of this video. However, one cannot discuss the story of Jesus of Nazareth and the surrounding history without getting into some things that are moralistic in nature and other things that some may consider fantastical or far-fetched. Brief History is a history channel, and thus this discussion is intended to be intentionally history-heavy, and this will become particularly evident as we get into the era of the Israelite kings and after. But as a viewer, I ask that if you are non-religious or skeptical of Christian claims, you bear with me when I discuss the more reality-defying aspects of Jesus' story. Similarly, if you are Christian, hold to the idea that the events in the Bible are true in their entirety, I ask that you bear with me as I discuss some of the drier and less lively aspects of history tied to Jesus' life. We will be discussing both. If you are only interested in learning the story of Jesus' life as he lived it on earth, you can skip ahead to this video timestamp, which will skip all of the Old Testament story and the history attached to it. Also, please note that we are dealing with ancient and biblical history here, and when one deals with ancient history, it quickly becomes apparent that there are different interpretations, beliefs, and disputes as to the validity or truth of any given statement or fact due to the fact that as one goes back in time, records become more scarce and can be less reliable generally speaking. I recognize this, but I don't believe that this is a good enough reason to not attempt to give the basics of this story. In short, there will be a lot of things that are stated or discussed in this video that may be disputed. I will try to note during the video, as much as I can, if something is particularly contentious or disputed, but this is an imperfect process. For the most part, I will just be giving one possible explanation or account on any given topic, and dates may be given as generalities so as to not get lost in the weeds. As I always do with all of my videos, if I make an error that is brought to my attention as clearly demonstrably false and not just a disputed topic, I will add these things to an errors and corrections section of the video description. As a viewer, please understand that this is not a scholarly piece of work, and I don't want it to be. I am not a scholar or a historian, and again, as I stated previously, the purpose of this video is to give a brief overview of Jesus' life and context. So that leads us into the last couple points of clarification before we begin. There is a degree of base knowledge that one must understand before watching this video, so as to make it understandable in the most basic sense. First off, it is important to note that the Christian Bible is a series of writings, aka books, that have been collected over time and put together into one collective work. It is laid out into two parts or testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is much older than the New Testament, and its writings were written or derived over thousands of years prior to Jesus' life and death. It lays out the history and teachings of the ancient Jewish faith, Jesus being a Jew in his time. The New Testament is much shorter. Its writings were written over approximately 70 years after Jesus' death, and it lays out the eyewitness testimony of Jesus' life and the beginnings of the early Christian church. The New Testament's first four books are known as the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you are interested in reading about Jesus' life and his message in full for yourself, these would be the four books to read, and I would encourage anyone interested in Jesus' life or Christianity in general to start there if you pick up a Bible for the first time. Furthermore, I want to note that I will be speaking plainly and affirmatively during the narration of this video and will not be qualifying every statement. So instead of saying something like God was said to have done X or it is thought that Jesus did Y, I will simply say God did X and Jesus did Y, so as to not extend the story any longer than needed. Again, please keep in mind that this video is coming from the Christian perspective. Lastly, I want to give some clarification on Judaism. Jewish people are an ethno-religious group, meaning that being Jewish can be referring to ethnicity or religion or both. Christians believe that the Jews, aka the Israelites as they are often called in the Old Testament, were God's chosen people. However, once Jesus came, a Jew himself, things changed. From a Christian perspective, Jesus ended the times of Jews being the exclusive chosen people and replaced them with his church, which is open to all that accept him as the Jewish Messiah. So although Jews still exist in the modern day, and they share the same religious history with Christians, they reject Jesus as the Messiah, and thus Christians don't believe that Jews of the modern day are still God's chosen people, Christians being those who do accept Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. However, because of the ethnic and religious aspect tied to being Jewish, this can be somewhat confusing. One, again from a Christian perspective, could be ethnically Jewish, but accept Jesus as the Messiah and be part of the new chosen people or covenant, if you will. This person would be Christian, but Jewish ethnically, referred to as Messianic Jews. Conversely, a non-ethnically Jewish person could convert religiously to Judaism and be considered Jewish technically speaking, although they are not Jewish ethnically. I think it is important to make these distinctions before we get started so as to distinguish the Jews we will discuss in the video and the Jews of the modern day. So with that being said, let us continue on to the video. We begin the story of Jesus with the story of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and brought forth light into the darkness. He continued on by creating Adam and Eve, believed by many to be the first man and woman to walk the earth. The man and woman were put into the so-called Garden of Eden, where they were instructed not to eat from a tree known as the Tree of Knowledge. There has been much speculation as to where the Garden of Eden may have been located, but many believe that it could have existed in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia is something we will touch on in much more detail, but for now it just needs to be known that Mesopotamia would be in modern-day Iraq and was the birthplace of some of the most ancient civilizations that we have record of. Adam and Eve are tempted by a serpent to eat from the tree of knowledge, which God has strictly forbade them to eat from, and they unfortunately succumb to this temptation. As a side note, this serpent is seen in Christian tradition as Satan, an angel that was created by God, but who was envious of God's power and thus tested God's authority by rebelling. He was cast down to earth and became the ruler of the physical world that we live in today, where he and his demons tempt all humans into sin. He, in a way, is the origin of evil. However, even though Satan, as the serpent, was the tempter of Adam and Eve, they, being free will agents, had the choice to reject the serpent's temptations and the evil that came along with it, but refused. This event led to what is often referred to simply as the fall, or the fall of man, thus bringing forth sin into the world. God, angered by Adam and Eve's disobedience, banishes them from the garden, refusing them the ability to eat from the tree of life, and thus eliminating their chance at immortality. Adam and Eve's free will choice to engage in this rebellion against God's requirements is what brought forth the issue of so-called original sin, which is the idea that all humans are born with a sin nature and that the guilt of Adam and Eve's sin is passed on to all who came after. In short, all humans will have the desire to turn from God naturally. Please understand that this is just one viewpoint on these issues, and we are already wading dangerously close into the waters of apologetics, which I do not want to get into, apologetics being the defense of one's religious faith through reason and logic. Just understand that different Christian denominations believe different things about a few of the issues I just touched on, and will believe different things on a few of the issues I will briefly touch on in the future. For instance, Calvinists, aka Reformed Christians, don't believe in free will, generally speaking, and Eastern Orthodox Christians don't believe in the guilt of original sin being passed on to or inherited by all people, generally speaking. So Adam and Eve reproduce, and the world begins to populate over time. Two of their sons, Cain and Abel, are famous for their bloody story in which Cain kills Abel out of jealousy, something we will not be getting into here. But from a biblical lineage perspective, it is Adam and Eve's third son, Seth, who is important to our story. We must pause for a moment here to note a few things. Number one, the Bible notes that the earliest humans lived for hundreds of years. So Adam lived for 930 years, his son Seth lived for 912 years, and so on and so on. Over time, these years decreased little by little to the point that they are at the ages that we typically see today. There are Christians who take this literally and those who do not. Some believe that these are literal ages of the people in the Bible, while others believe that they are representative numbers of something else and are not to be taken literally. Either way, given the genealogies that are listed throughout the Old and New Testament, we are able to trace Jesus' lineage all the way back to Adam. Here is a genealogy chart that we will be referencing throughout the video. We will not be touching on every person in the chart, but will highlight the important ones. The Bible actually has two different lineages for Jesus, one laid out in the Gospel of Matthew and one laid out in the Gospel of Luke. There have been some that have or have attempted to reconcile these differences, but we are not going to get into this here. For the sake of this video, we will be referencing the lineage as laid out in the Gospel of Matthew. So continuing on with the narrative, after 8 generations had passed, the next important biblical character comes about. His name was Noah, and he has one of the more well-known stories in the Bible that we will discuss briefly. In short, by the time Noah becomes an adult, God was unhappy with man and their evil ways. However, Noah was a faithful follower of God, and God was pleased by him. Thus, God determined to destroy all the people on earth with the exception of Noah and his family. God commands him to build an ark or ship, and to gather one male and one female of each animal to take on the ark to protect from the flood. Noah does so, and God floods the earth, but Noah and his family and the creatures on the ark with him are saved. Again, some Christians take this story literally, that the entire earth was flooded, while other Christians have a more nuanced view of the story of Noah, believing, for instance, that this was most likely a regional flood. Either way, Noah goes on to father 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem will be the important one to our story, but it is interesting to point out that Shem is often considered the father of the Asiatic peoples, where Ham is considered the father of the African peoples, and Japheth is the father of the European peoples. Noah dies at the ripe old age of 950, and through his son Shem, 10 generations pass before we get to the first major important character in the Bible from a history perspective, Abraham. Mesopotamia, the area we briefly touched on previously, has often been referred to as the cradle of civilization. due to the fact that some of the oldest known civilization discovered come from this area. The first or oldest recorded ancient civilization that we know of today is known as Sumer, which existed in power roughly around the year 3000 to 2300 BC. This civilization was non-Semitic and spoke a non-Semitic language called Sumerian. This language is considered an isolate language, which means that the language has no known relative languages, despite the fact that there were other languages being spoken in the region at the time. They utilized a writing system known as cuneiform, which was a system of writing that utilized wedge-shaped characters and looks like this. The Sumerian civilization, or dynasty rather, would eventually fall and be replaced by the so-called Akkadian Empire, which ran roughly between 2300 and 2100 BC. This empire, named for its capital city of Akkad, had both Sumerian and non-Sumerian speakers/influence. The non-Sumerian language was known as Akkadian, which was a Semitic language spoken in part by a group of less sophisticated and nomadic people from the west known as Amorites. There are no shortage of, quote, ites in the Bible, and in fact, here is a list of some of them. There are Jebusites, Girgashites, Kenites, Hittites, etc., etc. This can throw many people off when reading the Old Testament and the Bible, but in reality, most of these groups are not important to the grand scheme of the Bible and don't need to be known in depth. There are a handful of groups of peoples listed in the Bible that one would benefit knowing about, whether for historical purposes or geographical purposes, and I hope to be able to point some of these groups out in this video to distinguish between the important ones and the less important ones. The Amorites are one of the important groups of people that a reader of the Bible should know. Again, they were a nomadic, Semitic, somewhat unsophisticated people that came from the western regions of Mesopotamia, Syria, Canaan, Anatolia, etc., and they will become an important group as we go through the history narrative in the Bible. So the Akkadian Empire came and went in Mesopotamia, with its most famous leader being a man named Sargon of Akkad, who was successful in uniting the Akkadians and Sumerians to a degree, the Akkadians generally being from the north and the Sumerians generally being in the south. The Akkadian Empire, after falling to raiders from the north, was ultimately replaced by a dynasty known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, sometimes referred to as the Neo-Sumerian Empire. A couple small groups, however, did hold power between Ur's rise and the fall of the Akkadian Empire, most notably a group called the Gutians. This Third Dynasty of Ur lasted for about 100 years or so and was named after a city in lower Mesopotamia called Ur. As a side note, it is referred to as the Third Dynasty of Ur because Ur was thought to have held power a couple times during the Sumerian period we discussed previously and or before, but this is not important to the story. The city of Ur was in an area known as Chaldea in the southern regions of Mesopotamia, and this is important because Abraham is stated in the Bible as being from Ur in the Chaldees. The rulers of the Third Dynasty of Ur were Sumerian, hence why it is sometimes referred to as the Neo or New Sumerian Empire. But the Semitic and Sumerian peoples had, for all intents and purposes, integrated for the most part by this time. The Third Dynasty of Ur would ultimately fall around the year 2000 BC after pressures from the east and within the empire caused the fall of the dynasty. This brought forth an intermediate period where there was no central authority, and this is most likely when Abraham of the Bible was born around the year 1951 BC. After the fall of the Third Dynasty of Ur prior to Abraham's birth, a period known as the Isin-Larsa period came about, which refers to the two cities, Isin and Larsa, from which control was somewhat exerted or fought over. However, more importantly, northern Mesopotamia began to see other cities rise in power, specifically a city called Ashur, which would be from where the Assyrian Empire would eventually arise, an empire that we will discuss in much more detail shortly. It is likely that because of the fall of the Third Dynasty of Ur, many people in that area began to emigrate to other areas due to the possible chaos or uncertainty that existed after the fall. And it is with this in mind that we begin our story about Abraham, or as he was originally called, Abram. Abram, growing up, presumably in Ur, just after the fall of the Great Dynasty, eventually married a woman named Sarah, initially named Sarai. Eventually, Abraham, Sarah, Abraham's father Terah, and his nephew, a man named Lot, left Ur around 1917 BC and traveled northwest to a city in Mesopotamia named Haran on their way to a land called Canaan. This decision would have been made by Abraham's father, Terah, And again, this would have been during the intermediate time where the kings of Isin and Larsa were fighting for control over parts of Mesopotamia, but no real imperial control was being exerted in totality at the moment. Abraham's father, Terah, dies, probably in Haran, and it is most likely here that Abraham speaks to God directly for the first time and is called. He is instructed by God to depart from his father's family and to head south into the land of Canaan, where God promises that he will bless Abraham by making him a great nation. God also tells Abraham that he would give the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants. Thus, Abraham, still named Abram at the time, travels south and, after splitting with his nephew Lot, settles and builds an altar near a place called Mamre, which is near Hebron, south of Jerusalem. God then strikes a covenant with Abram and renames him Abraham and his wife Sarah. Abraham is to follow God's commands, and as a sign of the covenant with God, Abraham is commanded to circumcise every male born into his family. As a side note, this would have been around the time that the famous story of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah took place. Without getting into too much detail, essentially Abraham's nephew Lot, who had separated from Abraham, went to Sodom, and the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were prone to serious sexual deviancy to the point that they sexually threatened angels that had come to Sodom and who had been taken in by Lot. Thus, God destroyed both cities due to their wickedness, with the exception of Lot and his family. This is not a particularly important event as far as advance in the storyline goes, but I figured I would mention it since the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is so well known culturally. These cities and their fates still are used sometimes colloquially to represent deviancy in the modern day and the repercussions that can come about if someone engages in such deviancy. I also would like to go back for a moment to the point that I made earlier about Jesus being eternal from a Christian perspective, as around this time in the biblical narrative, there was an individual in the Old Testament story named Melchizedek that I am passing over for time purposes. The reason I bring him up is that some believe that Jesus presented himself throughout the history of the Old Testament in pre-incarnate form, or in disguise, if you will, prior to him actually coming to earth as Jesus of Nazareth. This type of appearance is referred to as a Christophany, and Melchizedek, who was basically a king priest who blessed Abraham after a military victory, is believed by some to be one of these Christophanies. So by this time, Abraham and Sarah were getting pretty old. Abraham was around 100 years old, and although God had promised the land to Abraham's descendants, Abraham and Sarah did not have any children yet, and they believed that they would never have children. However, although Abraham would produce children with other women, God promised Abraham that he would produce a child with Sarah, and thus Sarah did indeed conceive a child who was named Isaac. Isaac would be Abraham's only son, and he would inherit his father's wealth and covenant with God. Perhaps the most famous interaction of Abraham with God would be his interactions with regard to sacrificing his son and his successor Isaac. In short, God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son in order to show his obedience. Now, God did not allow Abraham to actually sacrifice his son, despite the fact that Abraham was perfectly willing to go through with this, but this event has a much greater meaning in the Christian understanding. This is a form of biblical foreshadowing in a way, in that a father sacrificing his son would eventually become the basis from which the Christian faith would be formed through Jesus, as we will see eventually. Abraham is also able to display the level of obedience he has to God, which serves to show the reader why he was chosen in the first place. Isaac eventually grows and marries his first cousin once removed, a woman named Rebekah. Abraham dies at the ripe old age of 175, and Isaac becomes the patriarch of the family. Isaac and Rebekah would eventually become the parents to two brothers named Jacob and Esau, and Jacob is the next important character that we will focus on in this video. Jacob doesn't necessarily start off on a great foot, as his story begins essentially with a great deception on his part. Being the younger brother to Esau, Jacob was not intended to be his father Isaac's successor. As Isaac was aging, he planned to bless his elder son Esau as essentially his heir apparent in a sense. This blessing would, quote, bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. However, Jacob, with help from his mother, Rebekah, tricks the nearly blind Isaac into thinking that he was his elder brother, Esau. Isaac, falling for Jacob's ruse, unintentionally blesses him instead of Esau. Esau, after finding out what had happened, conspires to kill Jacob, but Jacob is able to flee to safety in another region. Jacob, while essentially in exile or on the run from his brother's wrath, marries two sisters, Leah and Rachel. This is important because through these women and two of their servants, Jacob would have 12 sons, and these sons, named Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Joseph, and Judah, would be the forefathers of the so-called 12 tribes of Israel, the tribes' names deriving from the names of the sons themselves. The sons of Jacob will eventually become leaders over their own great houses, and their names will be used to designate specific tribes of Israel that will each grow to include thousands of people, although this will only become more important later in the story. It is also important to point out that Jacob would eventually reconcile with his brother Esau, and Esau's descendants would eventually settle in an area south of Israel called Edom, or Idumea, which will come up later. But where does the name Israel come from? Jacob, while on the run from his brother, was said to have camped alone, where he was visited by and wrestled with a man or angel who many believed to be God. After refusing to submit until he was blessed, God renamed Jacob Israel. This man or angel is also thought by some to be another example of a Christophany, a pre-incarnate form of Jesus presented in the Old Testament. So as far as Jacob or Israel, as he will now be referred to as sons, the last two I mentioned, Joseph and Judah, will become the most important as we continue. Judah, although as an individual will not be particularly important to the story, his tribe will become important, as his tribe will be the tribe that Jesus descends from. Joseph, one of Israel's youngest sons, grows and becomes his father's favorite. He was the son of Israel's wife Rachel, and of all the 12 brothers, only one, Benjamin, was Joseph's full brother. Joseph is probably most recognizable in a pop culture sense from the story of his, quote, coat of many colors. Israel, favoring Joseph over all the rest, gave him a coat of many colors, or robe, which caused the rest of Joseph's siblings to grow envious and hateful towards him. It should be noted that the brothers disliked Joseph for other reasons as well, including for his dreams, which will come up again shortly. Therefore, the scorned brothers collectively agreed to a plot to kill Joseph, but ultimately they, with suggestions from Judah, decided to sell him into slavery in Egypt instead, while convincing his father Israel that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. By this time, Israel and his family had settled back in the land of Canaan, so Egypt would have been south of where they had settled for the time being. Joseph was sold to an officer of the Pharaoh of Egypt. The Lord assists Joseph in his position as slave, and his master realizes this and eventually makes him personal attendant and head of his household. Unfortunately, Joseph's master's wife lusts after him, and when he rebukes her advances, she accuses him of attempted sexual assault, and Joseph is thrown into prison. While in prison, he interprets the dreams of two of Pharaoh's attendants who had fallen from grace at the moment and were in prison with him. These interpretations predicted the future and came true, and one of these attendants was ultimately restored to favor with the Pharaoh. A couple years later, Pharaoh begins having dreams of his own that he cannot interpret, and the restored attendant, remembering Joseph and his ability to interpret dreams, is suggested to Pharaoh. Therefore, Joseph is pulled from prison and brought into the presence of Pharaoh in order to interpret his dreams. Indeed, Joseph does interpret them and foresees a coming 7-year famine in the land after 7 years of prosperity. Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph that he makes him vizier over Egypt, essentially the second in command behind Pharaoh himself. This gives Joseph immense power, and he gets to work preparing Egypt for the coming famine. Indeed, what Joseph predicts comes true, and when the famine years come, Joseph's family in Canaan in the north are greatly affected by this. Israel sends his sons, Joseph's brothers who sold him into slavery, to Egypt to try and find food for their families and people. The brothers ultimately meet with Joseph, and although they don't recognize him, he recognizes them. After toying with them for a while, Joseph ultimately reveals his identity to them and forgives them for their actions. He then extends an offer to his father Israel and all of his father's family and people to emigrate to Egypt, and this offer is accepted. Joseph settles his father and his people in a region of Egypt that was known as Goshen, a lush area that was rich in resources, which is thought to have been an area to the east-northeast of modern-day Cairo and to the west of the modern-day Suez Canal. This is how the Israelite people came to live in Egypt, which would bring forth some of the most notable events in Christian and Jewish history. So we must now pause for a moment from the biblical narrative and talk about Egyptian history and how these events could have been possible. Before we touch on this, I would like to note that we left off in Mesopotamia with the end of the Isson-Larsa period, which again was essentially the period of time with no real central authority in the Mesopotamian region. We remember that this would have presumably been when Abraham was moving from Ur in the southern part of Mesopotamia to Haran and then down to the land of Canaan near modern-day Israel. The Isson-Larsa period was followed by an era dominated by a dynasty known as the Old Babylonian Empire. Old Babylon is referred today as, quote, Old Babylon, because it would only remain in power for about 300 years, approximately 1900 BC to 1600 BC. However, hundreds of years later, Babylon would re-emerge as an important regional power, hence the name Old Babylon. This is why we are touching on Babylon now, because we will have much more to say about Babylon later in the biblical story, and Babylon will play a very important role in the Jewish and Christian biblical history. The majority of the events we discussed when dealing with Abraham would have taken place during the Old Babylonian period. Old Babylon itself is probably most famous for a king named Hammurabi, who came to power around the time that Jacob and Esau were born. He was successful in bringing many surrounding powers to heel and established a famous code or law known as the Code of Hammurabi, which in essence is one of the earliest written law codes from Mesopotamia. After Hammurabi's death, the Old Babylonian Empire began to fragment and decline. There was a growing power to the northwest in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, known as the Hittites, who would eventually form the Hittite Empire. Due to the declining state of Old Babylon, it only took one lightning raid into Babylon from the Hittites for the empire of Old Babylon to fall completely. Babylon the city was sacked, and the king at the time was killed. However, after the destruction, the Hittite invaders did not stick around. They headed back to the north, and Babylon was ultimately taken over by a group of people known as the Kassites, who would exert relatively peaceful control for a few hundred years. This is where we leave Babylon, but we will soon return to them because, as stated previously, they are very important to the biblical narrative later on. So although we have discussed the overarching story of Mesopotamia and the different dynasties that controlled the region, it is important to note that there were other civilizations near Mesopotamia that were flourishing and going through their own incredibly interesting history at the same time. One of these civilizations to the west and southwest of Mesopotamia was Egypt. Now, most people, generally speaking, have a basic knowledge or understanding of ancient Egypt: pyramids, pharaohs, mummies, hieroglyphs, etc. We are going to discuss them perhaps in a little more depth than this surface level understanding, but again, we are not going to get too far into the weeds here, as there is a seemingly never-ending trove of information that can be discussed when referencing Egypt. Nevertheless, some of the most important biblical stories come from the land of Egypt, so it is important to understand a few things. To start, Egypt is one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history, spanning over 3,000 years. That means that there were quite a few important events in Egyptian history that took place prior to the biblical narrative crossing paths with Egyptian history. The ancient history of Egypt is often viewed through the lens of the many dynasties that came to power throughout its history, which total 31 in all. Here is a general breakdown of the Egyptian eras and the dynasties that made up the eras. Generally speaking, the time periods in history when Egypt was united and ruled by one ruler were called kingdom periods, and the times when it was divided and ruled by more than one ruler were called intermediate periods. The periods and the dynasties that were included in them are not all wholly agreed upon, and some of the cutoffs are disputed, but this is not all that important to the story we are discussing today, and we are looking more at generalities here to try and get a grasp on time frames. We start with the early dynastic period, which included the first and second dynasties, the Old Kingdom of Egypt period, which included the 3rd through 6th dynasties, the first intermediate period, which included the possible 7th through 11th dynasties, the Middle Kingdom of Egypt period, which included the 12th, maybe some of the 11th dynasties, the second intermediate period, which includes the 13th through 17th dynasties, the New Kingdom of Egypt period, which includes the 18th through the 20th dynasties, the third intermediate period of Egypt, which includes the 21st through the 25th dynasties, the late period of Egypt, which includes the 26th through the 31st dynasties in Egypt and includes Persian control of the region, a group of people we will touch on eventually, and lastly, the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, which came about after the Greek warrior Alexander the Great conquered the Persians. Again, we will discuss all that in a bit. So it is important to note that Egypt was often split during these intermediate times between what is called Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt was closest to the Mediterranean Sea, and Upper Egypt was south of Lower Egypt, these names being derived from the elevation in those areas. To give a little perspective time frame-wise, the pyramids of Giza were built during the 4th dynasty in the Old Kingdom of Egypt period, around 2500 BC, whereas Abraham and his story takes place during the Middle Kingdom of Egypt period, when the 12th dynasty was in power. In fact, although this story was not discussed, Abraham actually traveled to Egypt for a time during a famine, and it is thought that he and his wife interacted with the pharaoh there at the time, who was probably Senusret III. King Tut would have been part of the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom of Egypt period, the 18th dynasty being the dynasty of the Exodus, which we will discuss shortly, and the famous Cleopatra, aka Cleopatra VII, would have been part of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. So we can see that some of the most famous parts of Egyptian history are pretty well spread out over thousands of years. The story of Joseph that we just discussed would have taken place during the second intermediate period, again meaning that Upper and Lower Egypt were split at this time between two rulers or dynasties. Lower Egypt, where Joseph would have been controlled at the time by the 15th dynasty, and Upper Egypt would have been controlled eventually by the 16th and 17th dynasties. What's interesting is that the 15th dynasty was made up of a group or type of people referred to as the Hyksos, who had been coming into the kingdom from the east during the 13th and 14th dynasties time frame previously. The Hyksos differed from the true native Egyptians in that they, like the Israelites, were thought to be a Semitic people, and it is thought that they may have derived from the nomadic Amorites that we discussed previously, Amorites being the group of people that were very influential in the beginning of the Akkadian and Old Babylonian periods we briefly touched on. Some have noted that this may be why or how Joseph was able to work up through the ranks of society to become vizier under Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh in Lower Egypt at the time would have been a 15th dynasty Semitic Hyksos pharaoh, in essence a Semitic cousin to Joseph. This also could explain why things ended up getting so bad for the Israelites as time went on in Egypt. Israel the man, or Jacob if you will, begins to decline and brings his sons to his side for his final blessings. He skips over the first 3 sons and instead places his blessing on Judah. And we today, of course, know that this is important because Jesus would ultimately come from the tribe of Judah. So Israel/Jacob and Joseph both die, and years after Joseph's death, major changes begin to happen in Egypt. The native Egyptians hated the Hyksos due to their foreign Semitic background, and the 17th dynasty that eventually came to power in the south began to push for united Egypt once again. They were keen on getting rid of the detested foreign Hyksos, and they were ultimately successful in accomplishing this. The detested Hyksos were thrown out, and Egypt was united under one ruler, which began the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom of Egypt period. Unfortunately for the Israelites, who had by this time prospered and multiplied in the area of Egypt known as Goshen, they too came into the crosshairs of the Egyptian pharaohs due to their foreign and Semitic background as well. So it is here that we return to the biblical narrative once again. The Israelites in Egypt begin to be oppressed by the new pharaohs of Egypt, and they ultimately become slaves to the Egyptians. The pharaoh becomes concerned that the Israelite population is becoming too large, and thus he orders that all of the newborn Israelites be killed. This is where the next important biblical character comes into the picture, Moses. Moses was a baby at the time and at risk of being killed by the Egyptians. Therefore, his mother placed him in a basket and puts the basket in the reeds near the Nile River. Moses is ultimately found by Pharaoh's daughter and raised with the royal family of Egypt, and in fact, it was Pharaoh's daughter that was the one who gave Moses his name. There has been much speculation as to who Pharaoh's daughter was, but some believe that it may have been a woman named Hatshepsut, daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I. She would eventually go on to become Pharaoh herself, but she was not well liked and died under mysterious circumstances. She would then be replaced by her stepson, Thutmose III, who would go on to be one of the greatest pharaohs militarily in Egypt's history, conquering all of Canaan and bringing the border of Egypt all the way up to the borders of the Hittite Empire, briefly touched on previously. We remember that the Hittites were in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and responsible for sacking Babylon and ending the old Babylonian dynasty. Of course, it should be noted that it has not definitively been proven that the pharaohs just mentioned were the pharaohs discussed in the biblical narrative. There are, of course, many who would disagree with the notion that was just put forward, but again, I am only putting forth one possibility that would make sense. Moses eventually grows into a man and gets in touch with his Semitic and Israelite roots. He then sees an Egyptian physically beating and abusing an Israelite, which causes him to kill the Egyptian man. Pharaoh, after finding out about this, attempts to have Moses killed, but Moses flees Egypt and travels to a place called Midian on the Arabian Peninsula. There he is taken in by a shepherd priest, and this shepherd priest gives his daughter to Moses in marriage. Moses lives at Midian for many years, until one day, while shepherding sheep, he takes his flock to the side of the mountain, where the angel of the Lord appears to Moses in the form of a burning bush. God reveals to Moses that he has heard the cries of his people, the Israelites, in Egypt, and has decided to save them from their oppression. He tells Moses that he has been chosen as the man who will deliver the message to Pharaoh that his people must be released. Moses hesitates due to the fact that he does not consider himself a good orator, which angers God. But God allows Moses to use his elder brother Aaron, who God had called to come visit Moses in Midian, as his spokesperson for a time. Therefore, Moses and Aaron return to Egypt with the task of freeing God's people from their Egyptian oppressors. They meet with the elders of the Israelites and convince them that the time has come for them to be rescued from the hands of the Egyptians, and that Moses is the person to lead them out of captivity. Moses and Aaron go to the Pharaoh and request that the Israelites be allowed to go out into the wilderness, but God hardens Pharaoh's heart and he refuses. Instead, he increases the Israelites' workload tremendously, burdening God's people even more so than they had been burdened in the past. By this time, Thutmose III would have died, and that meant that it was most likely his successor, Amenhotep II, that was the pharaoh that Moses and Aaron were dealing with. He was a very aggressive military commander early on in his reign. Moses and Aaron perform miracles in front of Pharaoh, but Pharaoh calls in his sorcerers and magicians who perform the same tasks, and thus Pharaoh does not believe Moses. Therefore, God brings forth 10 plagues to inflict upon Egypt. These plagues include the water of the Nile turning to blood, a swarm of frogs, a swarm of gnats or lice, a swarm of flies, livestock being killed in mass, skin boils for the people, hail, swarms of locusts, darkness, and lastly, the eldest male child or firstborn sons of Egypt are to be killed. After each plague, Pharaoh promises to let the Israelites go, but multiple times goes back on his word as God continues to harden his heart. The last plague is the most important in the biblical narrative, as this final plague has an important story attached to it. God commands the Israelites to kill a 1-year-old male lamb without blemish, and to take its blood and wipe it on the lintels and doorsteps of the houses that they will eat the lamb in. On the day that God sweeps through the land of Egypt to take the lives of all the firstborn sons, he will pass over any of the households that have the blood on the lintels and the doorsteps. Indeed, the final plague is realized. The eldest sons in Egypt are killed, with the exception of those who are passed over, and devastation is brought to the people in the land of Egypt. This event is the origin of the holiday known as the Passover, an event that has been memorialized and celebrated in Jewish tradition all the way through the life of Jesus and into the modern day. It is important to note that this event is a major foreshadowing event when it comes to dealing with Jesus, as the unblemished lamb who is sacrificed to save God's people can be seen as a representation of Jesus over 1,000 years before Jesus actually walked the earth. After the 10th plague is realized and the firstborn sons are killed, Pharaoh finally relents and lets the Israelites go, as his eldest son is killed by this event. Interestingly, Amenhotep II did have a son that died young, and in fact, it was his second son who would succeed him as Pharaoh. Despite Pharaoh giving way, God continues to harden his heart, and Pharaoh eventually changes his mind and pursues the Israelites with his army and chariots after the Israelites had left Egypt. God leads the Israelites via pillars of clouds and fire to the Red Sea, possibly the Gulf of Suez or the Gulf of Aqaba. They become trapped by the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army, but God commands Moses to raise his staff and to hold out his hand to the sea. When Moses does this, the sea parts, and the Israelites are able to safely cross to the other side. Pharaoh's army, however, pursue the Israelites into the sea, and their chariots get bogged down by the mud. After the Israelites finish their crossing, Moses waves his hand once again, and the sea returns to normal, engulfing Pharaoh's army and his chariots. Pharaoh survives and returns to Egypt to live out the rest of his reign. Amenhotep II, after having a particularly aggressive start to his reign, was said to have had a relatively quiet second half to his reign, and some believe that this may have been due to his experiences with the Israelites. Again, all this is simply speculative. The Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years, and they left there in 1447 BC. This event is famously referred to as the Exodus today, and its story is contained in the book of the Bible with the same name. The Israelites may have been out from under the thumb of the Egyptians, but Egypt would remain a world power for over 1,000 years after this event, and they will come up again throughout the rest of the biblical story. Again, keep in mind that many of the major world civilizations that influenced the biblical story that we will touch on had events going on simultaneously in different regions. So although we will now shift away from Egypt, there will still be incredible things going on in Egypt as the rest of the biblical narrative played out elsewhere. And this will be true of any additional civilizations we touch on as well. The Israelites, led by Moses and Aaron, set out into the wilderness and are provided for by God, despite the fact that they continuously complain. The Israelites defeat the so-called Amalekites in battle, descendants of Esau, and begin to form a kind of civilization with hierarchies of able men to settle disputes for Moses. The Israelites eventually reach Mount Sinai. There has been much speculation as to the location of Mount Sinai. Some believe that it was on the Sinai Peninsula, while many believe that it was most likely in Midian. Moses goes up to the top of Mount Sinai, and God comes down to meet Moses there. There God gives Moses the 10 Commandments and tells Moses that they will conquer Canaan. This so-called Promised Land was presumably to the north or northeast of their location at Mount Sinai, and is essentially where we would think of modern-day Israel or Palestine to be. The Israelites promised to follow God's laws. However, Moses had gone to the top of the mountain to attain the 10 Commandments on stone tablets, and he is on the mountain for 40 days. During this time, God instructs Moses on how to build certain things like tabernacles, altars, and most importantly, the Ark of the Covenant, which, according to tradition, held the 10 Commandment tablets and was also used as a place where God would come down and speak to Moses or priests when traveling. In essence, the Ark of the Covenant would become the most holy object that the Israelites had. Moses' brother Aaron and his descendants are also designated as priests as well. It should be noted that both Moses and Aaron were Levites, meaning that they were part of the tribe of Levi and descendants of Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. This tribe will come up again shortly, as they will ultimately be designated as the priestly tribe in the near future. Unfortunately, it is here at the base of Mount Sinai that the Israelites begin the long and never-failing process of angering God by failing to live up to his requirements and commandments. Thinking that Moses had perished in the 40 days on the mountain, the Israelites melt down all their gold jewelry and make the infamous golden calf, which they begin to worship idolatrously. This, of course, angers God, and Moses for that matter. He actually breaks the tablets on the ground after seeing this. Moses pleads on behalf of the Israelites, and God ultimately relents in his punishment of them. But the Israelites were certainly punished for turning so quickly to a false god. Some in the camp were killed, the golden calf was ground up and put into water, which the Israelites were forced to drink, and a plague infected them for a time. Moses returns to the mountain, receives new tablets, and instructions to leave Sinai, and head to the promised land of Canaan. Moses returns from the mountain with his face glowing bright after speaking with God. The Israelites begin their journey to the promised land, and God leads them to where they are to camp via clouds, and at each camp location, a meeting place of the Lord was set up each time, essentially a tent where the Lord could communicate with the Israelites. Although they were always provided for, the Israelites continue to complain about an array of issues, like the type of food they have, etc., etc. Moses begins to go downhill physically, and the next important biblical character, a man named Joshua, is introduced as Moses' assistant. He will come up again shortly. So it is here that an unfortunate event takes place that will lead to unfortunate consequences for the Israelites. Moses sends some spies to scout out the land of Canaan to see if the people of the land are strong or weak, whether the strongholds are large or small, and whether the land is good or bad. When the spies come back, they tell the rest of the Israelites that the people in Canaan are strong and are fearful. This causes the Israelites to hesitate, and in fact, fearing the sword, aka being killed, they request to go back to Egypt. This, of course, angers the Lord again, and although he threatens pestilence, he relents once again after Moses begs for forgiveness on the Israelites' behalf. Due to this event and the Israelites' faithlessness, God states that no one in the current generation at the time will live to see the promised land, not even Aaron or Moses. It will be the children of this generation that will actually inherit the promised land, although Joshua, Moses' assistant, is exempted. Therefore, the Israelites are forced to roam the wilderness for 40 years until the elder generation dies out. Some of the people tried to make amends and traveled to Canaan anyways, but anyone who did this was killed by the local tribes and armies. There are many events that happened during the time that the Israelites were roaming in the wilderness that I will not get into, like Moses striking the rock to bring forth water, Moses' bronze pole serpent for those who were bitten by poisonous serpents, and the interactions with the surrounding kings. But if you are interested in those stories, you can reference the book of Numbers in the Bible. So it is important to note two things here. First, that the Israelites during this time of roaming continue to complain and fall short of God's requirements. This will be a common theme throughout the rest of the biblical narrative. Second, and more importantly, one must understand that Moses gave the Israelites the so-called law, or as it is referred to today, the Mosaic Law. This law was delivered to Moses by God and laid out acceptable practices for the Israelites in what they were to do and what they were not to do. This law covered an array of things, including rules for worshiping and sacrificing. It dictated what was clean and unclean, what could be eaten and not eaten, what could be touched and not touched, and what some would need to do if they came into contact with something or someone unclean. One example of something unclean would be a woman who was menstruating, and we touch on this specifically because this example will come up during the life of Jesus. The law laid out some basic legalistic laws like what is acceptable in the sanctity of the tabernacle, how the meeting place of the Lord is to be transported, and who was meant to administer these tasks, which were the Levites, as we already touched on. However, the law also discussed moral issues and what is acceptable and not acceptable with regard to these matters as well. This included laws related to idolatry, justice in legal matters, abominable practices, warfare, inheritance rights, marriage and divorce, rebellion, sexual immorality, offering and tithes, etc., etc. Moses warned that when the Israelites cross the Jordan River into the promised land, if they follow the law, they will prosper, but if they do not, they will suffer consequences. However, if at any time they fall short and fail in the eyes of God, they can repent, turn from their sins, and favor will be restored to them. Much of the Mosaic law and the Israelite actions after the Exodus can be found in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. With this, Moses dies at the age of 120, never getting to see the promised land of Canaan be conquered by his people. His assistant Joshua is chosen by God to be the next leader of the next generation of Israelites, and it will be under him that the promised land will be conquered by the chosen people of God. So God speaks to Joshua and commands him to take the first steps in conquering the promised land. Joshua crosses the Jordan River and begins to take major cities in the area, including Jericho, Lachish, Hebron, and of course Jerusalem. Local kings and tribes try to unite against the invading Israelites, but it is to no avail. God instructed that all inhabitants conquered by the Israelites be put to the sword, and indeed, for the most part, this is carried out. Although there are certainly interesting stories that took place during the 7-year time span of the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites, such as that of the story of the prostitute Rahab, the most important thing to take away from this time is that the conquest was successful and that the land was divided between the 12 tribes of Israel at this point. There is an interesting thing to point out here, however. There technically were 13 tribes in Israel. The tribe of Levi from which Moses and Aaron had descended, was not allotted any territory due to them being the priestly tribe. However, the tribe of Joseph split into two tribes, the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh. So although there were technically now 13 tribes, only 12 tribes actually inherited real estate in the Promised Land. Joshua ages and commands the Israelites to follow the law of Moses, lest they be punished for rebelling against this law. He erects a large witness stone and dies around the year 1375 BC, during the reign of Amenhotep III in Egypt. The 18th dynasty was still in power at this time and would be for another 80 years or so. Again, the reigns of some of the more famous Egyptian pharaohs happened during this time, including the reigns of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, aka King Tut. But by this time, there were other serious powers that had risen or were rising, and this will ultimately be where we now turn our attention. We remember that the Hittites in Anatolia were responsible for raiding Babylon centuries prior and bringing about the end of the Old Babylonian dynasty. By this time, they had grown in their power and prestige, and the so-called Hittite Empire had come to be. They were neighbored to the southeast by another regional power called the Mitanni, whose lands were essentially north of Israel. Egypt, concerned by the growing power of the Hittites, eventually allied themselves with the Mitanni for a time, but it would not be any of these groups who would be the next serious power to rise from a biblical perspective. Just to the east, in northern Mesopotamia, Assyria was beginning to grow ever stronger, and they would ultimately become a very influential culture when it comes to the history of the Bible, although at the time of the conquest of Canaan, the Assyrians were under Mitanni control and influence. The Babylonians still existed as well under Kassite rule in the southeast, although they were relatively quiet. However, as we will see, they too will have another day in the sun and play a major role in the history of Israel in the years to come. The Hittite Empire came about around the time of the Exodus and lasted about 300 years. They were threatened by the Assyrians and the Mitanni in the southeast and by the Egyptians to the south, but they were also threatened, quite frankly, by groups on all sides, including to their west. In fact, the Hittites were in a particularly difficult spot geographically speaking, as they were essentially landlocked. The so-called Mycenaeans were one of the groups of people to the Hittites' west, and they, along with a few other groups we will touch on later, will become the precursors to what we know today as the Greeks. The Israelites, or Hebrews, after establishing themselves in Canaan, entered into an era that is often referred to today as the era of the Judges. This era is laid out unsurprisingly in the book of the Bible called the Book of Judges. These judges were, in essence, people called by God to lead and correct the people of Israel, and did so, but not in a political leadership role or kingly role. The period of the judges lasts, generally speaking, for about 300 years, between 1350 BC and 1050 BC, and many times the judges' stories followed a similar underlying storyline. When the Israelites had conquered Canaan, they had been instructed by God to put all inhabitants to the sword and leave none left. Although they did this for the most part, they did still allow some to live, many of whom were allowed to live in the bottom rungs of society as laborers for the Israelites. Because of this, God states that these non-Israelites will be thorns in the Israelites' side, and indeed, that is what they become. Over time, they influence the Israelites to follow other gods, and thus God allows other nations to begin to conquer Israel for amounts of time. Israel is conquered by a Mesopotamian king for 8 years, but God calls the first judge Othniel, who saves Israel and brings forth rest for 40 years. The Israelites again go astray and begin to worship other gods, and they are defeated by a Moabite king, who they serve for 18 years. Ehud, the next judge, is raised by the Lord, and he defeats the Moabite king and brings 80 years of rest in Israel. This process is repeated multiple times, and Israel is defeated by kings or people from Philistia, Canaan, Midian, Ammon, etc. Each time they are saved by respective judges that God calls, including Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, and Samuel. Samson was gifted with superhuman strength and has a particularly interesting story, although we will not get into it here. But Samuel is the person we will focus on in a moment, as he is technically the last judge of Israel and will bring forth what is known as the United Monarchy in Israel. As far as events going on outside of Israel, there are a few things that we must touch on before we get to Samuel and the kingdom of Israel. We remember that Egypt's 18th dynasty was coming to an end, and the 19th dynasty that followed them continued the New Kingdom of Egypt period. The Hittite Empire is in full force as well to the north of Canaan, although it is most likely beginning to diminish. The Mitanni are eventually defeated by a squeeze play where the Hittites exerted pressure from the west and the Assyrians exert pressure from the east, and this event allows Assyria to break out on their own and begin their ascendancy. The Hittite Empire, again probably diminishing by this time, as well as the Egyptians, were becoming concerned by the rising influence and power of Assyria. However, around this time, a major event took place that would affect most of the major populations near Israel, and this event is referred to today as the Late Bronze Age collapse. During the collapse, a group of people known as the Sea Peoples, possibly groups of independent tribes from around the Mediterranean, swept through many civilizations and devastated them. This included the Mycenaeans in modern-day Greece, and more importantly, the Hittite Empire, which fell completely, although their people, of course, remained inhabiting the region in some capacity. Although the Sea Peoples attacked Egypt, they were repelled by the 4th pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, Meremptah, and the 2nd pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, Ramses III, years later as well. Although civilizations like Egypt and Assyria survived the Late Bronze Age collapse, they were still affected by it and saw a period of decline for some time, which allowed Israel to grow during this time. Returning to the biblical storyline, we turn our attention to Samuel, the last judge of the Israelite judges. A barren woman named Hannah meets with the current judge at the time, a man named Eli, and she is distraught at her inability to bear children. Although Eli initially thinks she is intoxicated, he soon realizes that she is not and tells her to go in peace and that the Lord will find favor in her. Indeed, Hannah conceives and gives birth to Samuel. Eli's sons end up being worthless men and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and thus God decides that Samuel will be the successor to Eli as judge. Samuel, after inheriting that role and executing his duties in that position, grows old over time, and he makes his son judges over Israel, but they begin accepting bribes and doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord. Therefore, the elders of Israel ask Samuel to create for them a king, since his sons are not walking in his ways, and he himself is getting old. Samuel does not want to do this, but God commands him to do so, since the Israelites have denied him, that is God, as their king. Despite Samuel's protestations and warnings, the Israelite people continue to push for a king, and so God sends a man for Samuel to make king over the Israelites, and his name is Saul. Samuel anoints Saul as king, thus ending the period of the judges in Israel and bringing forth the Israelite kingdom. God gives Saul a new heart, and he, along with his son Jonathan, do well in battle, defeating surrounding enemies. The Lord commands Saul to kill all of those who are defeated, but again, just as the Israelites had done after the conquest of Canaan, Saul disobeys and does not put everyone he defeats to the sword. Due to Saul disobeying God, the Lord regrets making him king, and from this time on, Samuel parts from Saul. Samuel, disappointed and grieved by the actions of Saul, is led to a man named Jesse by the Lord. Jesse is from the town of Bethlehem and of the tribe of Judah, and Samuel calls his youngest son from tending his sheep. This young man's name is David, and he will become the next important character in the story of Israel. Samuel anoints David, and the Spirit of the Lord rushes into him while departing King Saul. In fact, this Spirit of the Lord is replaced in Saul by a harmful spirit that torments him, and so his servants surrounding him suggest getting a lyre player to soothe his afflictions. They call for none other than David himself, who was known for being an excellent lyre player. As he plays lyre for Saul, the harmful spirits depart from Saul, and therefore Saul becomes very attached to David, to the point that he brings him into his household and shows him great favor. At this time, however, the Philistines were making war on Israel, Philistia being to the southwest of Israel, and the Israelites had gone out to confront them. David was splitting time serving Saul and helping his father tend sheep, and so was going back and forth between these places. 3 of his brothers were in the ranks of the Israelite army, and while he was at his father's house, David's father sends, in essence, a care package to be delivered to his brothers on the front lines. He delivers the care package to his brothers, but while there, he hears that the Philistines have chosen a champion who is calling someone to fight him in single combat. This Philistine man was said to have been a giant, 8 or 9 feet tall, and his name was Goliath. David asks Saul's permission to fight Goliath, since he had experienced fighting lions and bears while tending his father's sheep, and God had protected him against these dangerous animals. Saul consents to this, and David, unarmored, moves towards Goliath with only a smooth stone and a sling. After Goliath taunts David for his small and handsome stature, David and Goliath approach each other to begin their fight. David takes aim at Goliath with his sling and looses the smooth stone, which hits Goliath in the forehead, knocking him unconscious. David takes a sword and cuts off the head of Goliath, causing the Philistines to flee. David, of course, is considered a hero and is given large amounts of praise by the Israelite people. This causes consternation in Saul, who begins to look at David with contempt, for he begins to fear the power of David due to his newfound popularity. This jealousy grows to the point that Saul decides to try and kill David. However, by this time, David has struck up a friendship with Saul's son Jonathan, and Jonathan warns David to flee from Saul's household. Indeed, he does, and although Saul pursues him, he is unable to capture him. In fact, using stealth and wit, David is able to put himself in a position to kill Saul twice, but he chooses not to. Ultimately, Saul accepts that David will one day rule over Israel, and after David flees to Philistia for a while, Saul gives up pursuit of him. The Philistines once again make war on Israel, and this time Saul is defeated. He and his son Jonathan both die, Saul himself taking his own life after the defeat. This happens around the year 1010 BC, and after Saul's defeat, God commands David to return to Israel and go to the land of Judah. The people of Judah anoint him king over Judah for about 7 years in Hebron. This is due to the fact that a man named Abner, the commander of Saul's army, made another of Saul's sons, Ish-bosheth, king over Israel. War breaks out between David and Ish-bosheth, but ultimately Abner and Ish-bosheth are murdered, and David is anointed king over all Israel, the lands of Judah included. He moves from Hebron after 7 years to Jerusalem for the remainder of his kingship, which is 33 years. He brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem in about the year 1000 BC. David had many wives, but one in particular is important to note. While bathing on a rooftop, a woman named Bathsheba catches the eye of David, who proceeds to have adulterous sexual relations with her, Bathsheba at the time being married. She becomes pregnant, and David, in essence, murders her husband, a man named Uriah the Hittite, by sending him to the front lines of battle while commanding those around him to fall back and let him die. David is rebuked by a man named Nathan. Now, Nathan is important because he is really the beginning of a new age in Israel, which is, in essence, an age of prophets. Nathan was a prophet who spoke to God, and he rebukes David for his murder of Uriah the Hittite. This will be a common theme moving forward, that being a prophet with the ability to speak to God, condemning or advising a king in power at the time in Israel. Nathan was perhaps the first of these prophets, but as we will see, there will be many more to follow him, and the ones to come will be arguably some of the most famous people in all the Bible. The child Bathsheba conceived with David during their adulterous affair dies, but they conceive once more and have another child who survives, a son who is named Solomon. David declares that Solomon will be the one who will inherit his kingship, despite David having other sons at this time. After some other interesting events in David's life that are not particularly important to moving the story forward take place, David begins to decline. His fourth son, Adonijah, tries to make himself the heir, but David does not allow this and anoints his son Solomon as the next in line to inherit the throne. David dies around 970 BC, and Solomon begins to rule in his place. He marries Pharaoh's daughter and walks in the way of his father. God famously asks Solomon what it is that he desires, for God is willing to give him anything he wants. Solomon does not ask for wealth or power, he asks for wisdom. God is greatly pleased by Solomon's request and not only gives him a wise and discerning mind, but also wealth and prestige as well. This was a time of great peace and prosperity for Israel, and Solomon builds a temple to the Lord in Jerusalem, where the Ark of the Covenant is moved to. The building of this temple begins a period often referred to in Christianity as the First Temple period. God continues to warn that the Israelites must follow the law put down by Moses, and if they begin to disobey, they will be punished just as the Israelites were in ages past. Solomon, despite his wise and discerning mind, is unfortunately swayed away from the Lord in part by his love of women from other kingdoms. The Lord, angered by this, says the kingdom will be ripped away in part, although not from Solomon for the sake of Solomon's father David. Instead, it will be ripped away from Solomon's son. A man named Jeroboam was a servant to Solomon overseeing building works and labor. He runs into a prophet named Ahijah, who tears his clothes into 12 pieces, telling Jeroboam to take 10. Ahijah tells Jeroboam that he will take 10 tribes away from Solomon and that he, Jeroboam, will be the king over Israel. Solomon tries to kill Jeroboam but is unsuccessful, and Solomon ultimately dies, bringing his son Rehoboam to the throne. Unfortunately, Rehoboam was unwise in some of his decision-making. The Israelite people were experiencing some financial strife and requested some tax reforms to remedy this. Rehoboam turns from the counsel of wise old men to the counsel of foolish young men and declines to give any relief to his people. Thus, many people turn to Jeroboam and follow him instead. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Manasseh, and Ephraim, followed Jeroboam, and he becomes king of what will continue to be called Israel, although this Israel will now be split. 2 of the tribes, Judah and Benjamin, along with some of the priestly tribe of Levi, remain with Rehoboam and form the kingdom of Judah based out of Jerusalem. Thus the stage was set for the final chapter of Israel's history before the life of Jesus of Nazareth. We will be keeping track of what is going on between Israel, Judah, and some of its surrounding neighbors by using this map. We will reflect who the king was in Israel, any prophet who may have been active during his time, who the king was in Judah, any prophet who may be active in their time, and any particularly important monarch from surrounding areas as they become important to the story. So this may include Egypt, Syria, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, etc. We will also be noting whether each monarch in Israel or Judah was considered evil or good from biblical standards, which for the most part indicates whether they followed false gods or not, although a few of the kings will be considered particularly evil for other more sinister reasons. It is also important to pause here and look once again at the lineage of Jesus we touched on previously. You will note that Jesus' lineage includes the kings of Judah, and we will touch on each of these momentarily, although only briefly. We will begin our look at the kings of Israel and Judah with Jeroboam the first in Israel, who we just discussed in detail. He, in fact, specifically turned his people away from following the true God of Israel because he was fearful that if his people continued to follow this God, they may reconsider their choice to join his kingdom and turn back to Judah. He was considered evil, and as we briefly touched on earlier, he had the prophet Ahijah prophesying during his time, who prophesied that Jeroboam would indeed become king. It should be noted that Ahijah predicted the destruction of the house of Jeroboam due to Jeroboam's evil actions. In Judah, we have Rehoboam. He was also considered evil, and he had the prophet Shemaiah prophesying during his reign, who prevented Rehoboam from trying to forcefully bring back the 10 tribes who had sided with Israel. Shemaiah also prophesied that Rehoboam would be punished by a king in Egypt called Shishak. Indeed, Shishak of Egypt led a campaign against Judah and sacked Jerusalem, taking all of the treasure from the temple. Rehoboam is replaced by Abijah for a couple years. There's not much to say about him other than the fact that he was considered evil as well. He was replaced by a king named Asa in Judah, who was considered a good king. Hanani was the prophet to him in Judah. Asa reigned for a decent amount of time in Judah, and during his reign many kings of Israel came and went. Jeroboam dies in Israel and is replaced by his son Nadab, who was also considered evil. Nadab has a short reign because he is killed by his successor Baasha, who also destroys all of the house of Jeroboam, bringing the prophet Ahijah's prophecy to fruition. Asa in Judah and Baasha in Israel fight with each other, and Baasha had a prophet during his time in Israel named Jehu, who was the son of the prophet Hanani, prophesying to King Asa in Judah. The prophet Jehu spoke against Baasha's idolatrous ways and prophesied that the house of Baasha would meet the same fate as Jeroboam's, meaning that it would be destroyed. Indeed, when Baasha's evil son Elah comes to the throne after Baasha's death, he is killed by a military commander named Zimri, who destroys the rest of the house of Baasha as well. Zimri, who was also considered evil, had a short reign due to the fact that the people of Israel rose up against him after he killed the king. Zimri is replaced by another military commander chosen by the Israelites, who is said to have been more evil than anyone before him, Omri. Omri purchases land and builds the city of Samaria, which becomes Israel's capital. Samaria, of course, will become a well-known region in the time of Jesus. Omri is replaced by another particularly evil king, Ahab, and it is during his reign that we are introduced to one of the more important prophets in biblical history, Elijah. Elijah predicts drought and famine in the land of Israel, which comes true, and he confronts Ahab about his idolatrous worship of the pagan god Baal. He goes toe-to-toe with Ahab's pagan priests of Baal, in which both kill a bull for a sacrifice. The priests of Baal call for Baal to bring fire to their sacrifice, but nothing happens. Elijah then calls on the one true God of Israel to bring fire to his sacrifice, and the bull erupts into flames. After this, Elijah is forced to go on the run, and he is commanded by God to anoint 3 people. One is to be the king in Syria, named Hazael. One is to be the king of Israel, named Jehu, and the last is to be his own replacement, a man named Elisha. Elijah anoints Elisha, and either he or Elisha eventually anoint the other 2, which will come up again shortly. As a side note, Elijah, and eventually Elisha, was the leader of a group of people known as the Sons of Prophets, essentially a congregation or group of prophets that trained under him. One of Elijah's disciples, a prophet named Micaiah, prophesied that Ahab would die in battle against the Syrians. During the reign of Ahab of Israel, good King Asa of Judah dies and is replaced by his son Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat is considered a good king like his father, and he makes peace with Ahab in Israel. During his reign, Ahab of Israel, unsurprisingly, dies in battle fighting the Syrians, fulfilling Micaiah's prophecy, and is replaced by his son Ahaziah. Ahaziah is considered an evil king and reigns for only a short time. Moab rebels against Israel during his reign, and he has an accident where he falls through a lattice and suffers a serious injury that he would never recover from. In fact, the prophet Elijah specifically tells Ahaziah that he will never recover. Perhaps the most important event during Ahaziah's reign is Elijah being taken up into heaven on chariots of fire. At this point, Elijah is replaced by his successor, Elisha. King Ahaziah dies and is replaced by his brother Jehoram, who is considered evil, although not quite as bad as his father Ahab. We're going to come back to Jehoram in a moment. During Jehoram of Israel's reign, Jehoshaphat in Judah dies and is replaced by his son, also named Jehoram. So during this time, we have a king named Jehoram in both Israel and Judah. The Jehoram in Judah took over the throne before his father Jehoshaphat died and was considered an evil king as well. The prophets Obadiah and Joel are thought to have possibly prophesied during his reign. Jehoram of Judah is interesting in that he married a daughter of evil King Ahab of Israel named Athaliah, which meant that the other Jehoram in Israel was actually his brother-in-law. Jehoram of Judah dies and is replaced by his son Ahaziah, not to be confused with the Ahaziah of Israel we already touched on. He is also considered evil in the eyes of the Lord. For anyone keeping track, Ahaziah in Judah is the nephew of Jehoram of Israel, Ahaziah's mother Athaliah being Jehoram of Israel's sister. So here's where things get a little interesting. We remember that the prophet Elijah and Elisha had been commanded to anoint and/or had anointed someone named Hazael to be king in Syria. Syria is different from Assyria, which we will discuss momentarily. When we refer to Syria, we are talking about an area north of Israel near where the modern state of Syria exists today. It could also be called Aram Damascus as well. After interacting with Elisha, Hazael does end up becoming king in Syria, and he moves against Israel. Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah team up to fight against Hazael, but Jehoram is injured in battle. Jehoram's nephew, Ahaziah of Judah, comes to visit him while he is recovering. Now, we also remember that the prophet Elijah had been commanded to anoint a man named Jehu to be king over Israel. Well, Jehu was a military commander in Israel, and Elisha sent one of those sons of prophets to anoint him as king of Israel, and instructed him to kill Jehoram of Israel and all of Ahab's descendants. So Jehu travels to Jehoram of Israel, who is recovering from his wounds after battling the king of Syria, Hazael. Jehu slays Jehoram of Israel and takes his place as king of Israel. However, we remember that Ahaziah of Judah was there visiting his uncle, and Jehu decided to kill Ahaziah of Judah as well for good measure. This he was not supposed to do, and because of this action, the prophet Elisha pronounces judgment on him in that the house of Jehu will not last for more than 3 generations. In Judah, Ahaziah's mother, Athaliah, seizes power after her son's death and becomes the only ruling queen in the Israelite Judah kingdoms. She, being evil King Ahab of Israel's daughter, is particularly evil herself and attempts to wipe out all of her family members that could contest her throne. Her grandson, a boy named Jehoash, son of the now killed King Ahaziah of Judah, is protected by one of his siblings. He eventually is brought forth and anointed and takes the throne from his evil grandmother Athaliah, who is killed. Now this all plays out while Jehu is still king in Israel. He did a few good reforming actions like killing the prophets of Baal in Israel, but he ultimately does what is evil in the sight of the Lord because he allows the golden calves to remain in place for worship purposes. More importantly, however, was the fact that Hazael in Syria starts to gain substantially in his endeavors against Israel. Hazael starts to take over parts of Israel, which is very concerning to Jehu. Unfortunately for Jehu, Hazael and the Syrians would not be his only concern when it came to aggressive and powerful neighbors. In fact, the next major power in the Near East had by this time already established itself as a force to be reckoned with. This power would play a major role in Israel's history moving forward and would ultimately lead to the destruction of the state of Israel itself. This power was, of course, the Assyrians. So at this point, we must pause and briefly discuss Assyrian history leading up to this point, as Jehu will ultimately request support from the Assyrians. We remember that Assyria, again different from Syria, who is being led by Hazael, began with the city-state of Ashur, which began to rise after the fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. This can generally be called the early Assyrian period. Located in the northern part of the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, Ashur was eventually absorbed by Hammurabi's Old Babylonian Empire and then eventually by the Mitanni. This would be a time generally referred to as the Old Assyrian period. After the Hittites in Anatolia and Assyria began to put pressure on the Mitanni on 2 fronts, the Assyrians began to break free into their own separate entity. The first king to establish himself as an independent ruler in Assyria was Ashur-uballit I, who ushered in the so-called Middle Assyrian Empire. The break from the Mitanni and the establishment of the Middle Assyrian Empire would have all been, generally speaking, during the time of the Israelite judges and the United Israelite Monarchy. Assyria at one point became so worrisome to both Egypt and the Hittites that these 2 former enemies eventually formed an alliance to combat the rising threat of the Assyrians to the east. This was in part for economic and cultural reasons, but also due to the fear that Assyria began to spread due to their notorious brutality. We remember that the late Bronze Age collapse and the invasion of the Sea Peoples affected many in the Near East, including Assyria. Although Assyria saw a general decline during this time, they weren't quite as affected as other civilizations, nor was their empire completely wiped out like the Hittites had been. Assyria would eventually begin to recover and gain substantially around the time that the kingdoms of Israel and Judah split. Under the first king of the so-called Neo-Assyrian Empire, Adad-nirari II, Assyria would begin to grow into its strongest form and come to encompass Babylonia to the south. After a few kings had come and gone after Adad-nirari II, Shalmaneser III came to power in Assyria, and he was the Assyrian king when Jehu was king in Israel. Shalmaneser III campaigned against Hazael in Syria, forcing Hazael to retreat within his walls in Damascus. Jehu, sensing the riskiness or perhaps even the futility of standing up to Shalmaneser III, pays him tribute instead, which can be seen in this image from the so-called Black Obelisk Shalmaneser III. With that, we return to the biblical narrative and continue with the kings of Israel and Judah, but we will keep our eye on Assyria as well because they will become particularly important shortly, as we will see. While Jehu is ruling still in Israel, we remember that Jehoash came to power in Judah. He was the king who had been hidden away when his grandmother Athaliah had tried to wipe out all the claimants to the throne so that she could stay in power. Jehoash came to the throne of Judah at 7 years of age, and he was initially a good king when he was under the influence of the high priest. However, he eventually turned to evil ways after the high priest's death and began to turn from the Lord. Hazael in Syria was a threat to its neighbor Israel, yes, but Hazael was also a serious threat to Jehoash in Judah, as Jehoash was forced to give all of the gold of Jerusalem's temple to Hazael in order for Hazael to call off an attack that he had led on Jerusalem. Jehu of Israel dies during Jehoash of Judah's reign, and Jehu is replaced by his son Jehoahaz, an evil king who is said to have been given into the hand of the Syrians often. Jehoash of Judah dies by assassination during the reign of Jehoahaz of Israel, and he is replaced by his son Amaziah, who avenges his father's death by killing those responsible for his assassination. He, like his father, was initially a good king, but he too eventually turned to evil ways. During Amaziah's reign, Jehoahaz of Israel dies, and he is replaced by Jehoash of Israel. Amaziah of Judah, propped up by some victories he had won against the Edomites, provokes war with Jehoash of Israel. This was not a good idea, because he was defeated and captured by Jehoash. The temple of Jerusalem was looted by Jehoash of Israel. Amaziah eventually was able to somehow flee and was assassinated by his own subjects. However, Jehoash of Israel died before Amaziah of Judah's death, and he was replaced by a king named Jeroboam II in Israel. Jeroboam was an evil king, but he had a relatively successful reign due to Assyria experiencing a down period, which allowed Israel to have an era of peace and prosperity. There are three important prophets during this time: Amos, Hosea, and Jonah. Amos and Hosea warn and prophesy the coming destruction of Israel and warn not to be too comfortable during this period of prosperity. Jonah, on the other hand, is particularly interesting because he is ordered by God to go and preach repentance to the Assyrians, and specifically to a city called Nineveh. Although Jonah tries to avoid going to Nineveh, God makes it so that it is impossible for him not to. Jonah preaches to the Ninevites, and according to the Bible, they repent from their sins. Interestingly, Jonah's mission to Nineveh would have been most likely during the reign of Shalmaneser IV of Assyria. He was reflected in Assyrian annals as a weak king and oversaw the short period of decline which allowed Israel to prosper. Some have concluded that this may have been due to the preaching of Jonah in Nineveh. Nevertheless, Amaziah of Judah's assassination by his own subjects took place during Jeroboam II's reign in Israel. Amaziah is replaced by a king named Uzziah, sometimes called Azariah, in Judah. Uzziah was considered a good king, but he was known for making a mistake in the temple of God by burning incense, which was against a very important rule within the Jewish faith. Doing so essentially meant that Uzziah was attempting to become the high priest while also being the king, a spot that would be reserved for the Jewish Messiah, someone who would deliver God's chosen people to glory from their oppressors. Due to his transgression, Uzziah was struck with leprosy and was forced to co-reign with his son for a time. Uzziah also most likely co-reigned with his father as well when his father still lived. Nevertheless, Uzziah had a relatively long reign, and during his reign, incredible events began to play out in the Israelite kingdom to the north. Jeroboam II dies and was replaced by his son Zechariah, who is considered an evil king. He reigns for a short time before he is killed by a captain in his own army, a man named Shallum. This brings an end to the house of Jehu after 3 generations, fulfilling the prophecy of Elisha. Shallum himself reigns for only a short time before he is killed by another of Zechariah's captains, a man named Menahem. Menahem assumes the kingship in Israel, becoming an evil king in the eyes of God. During his reign, the king of Assyria, Ashur-Nirari V, dies, and this brings forth a king in Assyria who would end the decline of the Assyrian Empire. His name was Tiglath-Pileser III, and in bringing Assyria out of a decline, he becomes very aggressive internationally. After putting down rebellions at the beginning of his reign in the east, which included the Babylonians and a group of people called the Medes, 2 groups that would come back with a vengeance against Assyria, he eventually turns his attention to the west. Uzziah in Judah, the leper, eventually dies and is replaced by his son Jotham, a good king who again was thought to have ruled as a co-monarch with his father. His reign is interesting in that there was a prophet during his time named Micah who prophesies that Israel and Judah will be destroyed. What's interesting, however, is that he speaks of the restoration of Israel and prophesies that a king, priest, or Messiah will come to save the nation of Israel. He states specifically that this new king will come from the town of Bethlehem in Judah. It is also during Jotham's reign that one of the most important prophets is called in Judah, one of the 4, quote, major prophets, who was named Isaiah. We will touch more on Isaiah in a moment, but it is important to note that when we use the term major, we are not referring to the importance of the prophet. Instead, the 4 major prophets of the Bible are set apart from the 12 minor prophets due to the amount of writing or teachings they contributed to the canon of Scripture, the book of Isaiah being one of the larger prophetic books in the Bible. Jotham of Judah would be replaced by his son, an evil king named Ahaz, who we will return to in a moment. In Israel, Menahem, who had paid tribute to Tiglath-Pileser in Assyria, died while Uzziah and Jotham were ruling jointly in Judah. He was replaced by his son named Pekahiah, an evil king who reigned only a couple years before he was killed by one of his army captains, a man named Pekah. Pekah, seizing power and becoming the next evil king of Israel, allies with the king of Syria named Rezin, and they together try to force the new king of Judah, Ahaz, to join their alliance. Ahaz, instead, despite protestations from the prophet Isaiah, appeals to the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, who leads a campaign against Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel. Rezin of Syria is defeated and killed, while Pekah in Israel is killed by his army captain, a man named Hoshea, who is rewarded by Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria by being made king. Hoshea, again another evil king, pays tribute to Tiglath-Pileser, but Tiglath-Pileser dies only a few years later. After his death, Hoshea of Israel decided to rebel against the new Assyrian king, a man named Shalmaneser V. This, again, was a bad idea. Shalmaneser V attacks Israel and takes its capital, Samaria. Israel is ultimately decimated, and Hoshea the king is either killed or captured. Although Shalmaneser V does not live long enough to see the full effects of his defeat on Israel, his successor Sargon II of Assyria completes Shalmaneser's conquest, defeating the Israelites once and for all. He deports the Israelites from the northern kingdom of Israel, thus ending the kingdom of Israel altogether and beginning the so-called Assyrian captivity. We remember that Israel encompassed 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, Israel in this sense meaning all of the Israelites, and this event is where we get the notion of the, quote, 10 lost tribes of Israel. However, it should be noted that members of these so-called 10 lost tribes surely escaped and made their way to Judah, where their tribes and their lineages continued on. Samaria, in the northern region of Israel, is repopulated by the Assyrians. Thus, this area becomes a mixed bag of paganism and Judaism, which is why it will ultimately be distinguished from Israel or Judah during the time of Jesus as a hostile area, and why the Samaritans will ultimately come to be seen as a different type of people from the Jews in the New Testament. Ahaz of Judah, for his part, did not rebel against the Assyrians and continued to pay tribute to Shalmaneser V and Sargon II of Assyria. He dies and is succeeded as king by his son Hezekiah, a good king of Judah, who has perhaps one of the most eventful reigns in the history of the monarchy of Judah. Hezekiah destroys all of the idol worship areas, and he followed God properly, generally speaking, but the story of Hezekiah must also be told in unison with the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah was a trusted advisor of King Hezekiah, and among his vast array of prophecies, Isaiah had prophesied the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel. He, like prophets previously, prophesied the coming judgment of Judah, of Assyria, Babylon, and of the surrounding tribes, etc., etc., but he also prophesied the redemption of Israel and the return of those who would be exiled. However, he also has some very interesting prophecies, which we remember came hundreds and hundreds of years prior to the birth of Jesus. Isaiah prophesied specifically that a virgin shall give birth to a son who shall be named Emmanuel. He prophesies about a suffering servant who will suffer for the people, and that foreigners will be brought into God's house. Isaiah, acting as a close advisor to the king, also played an important role in assisting Hezekiah in his decision-making. Sargon II of Assyria, who had overseen the deportation of the northern kingdom of Israel, was relatively successful in expanding his territory. However, he experienced troubles in the south, in Babylon, when an individual named Merodach-Baladan, a native Chaldean like Abraham, was able to take control of Babylon for many years. Sargon II was able to ultimately retake Babylon and exile Merodach-Baladan for a time, but it was clear that the Babylonians were becoming a problem in the south. Sargon II was succeeded by a man named Sennacherib in Assyria, and Hezekiah in Judah used the death of Sargon II as an excuse to rebel against Assyria. This moment was used by many others in the surrounding areas under Assyrian control to revolt as well. In fact, Hezekiah had been planning a revolt for some time, but had delayed so that he could prepare for what might come when he did so. He was bolstered in his confidence by Isaiah, who supported his decision and claimed that God would protect Judah. Isaiah was also clear that Assyria itself would ultimately be destroyed. Isaiah, however, also warned against allying with other powers, including the likes of Egypt, for he made it clear that these powers would suffer the same wrath of God as the Assyrians would. Sennacherib, after putting down a revolt in Babylon, once again led by Merodach-Baladan, who had returned from exile, turned his attention to the west and moved to confront Hezekiah and any surrounding nations that rebelled. His army swept through the region and took major cities controlled by Hezekiah, including Lachish. The prophet Isaiah supported Hezekiah and pushed him to remain strong against the seemingly endless might of Sennacherib and his army. Although Hezekiah was thought to have tried to pay off Sennacherib, the Assyrian king still moved on Jerusalem and laid siege. This is where things took an unexpected turn. Sennacherib, for whatever reason, was forced to pick up and leave. He did not attack Jerusalem as he had the other cities in the area. The Bible claims that an angel of the Lord came to Sennacherib's camp in the middle of the night and slew thousands of his men, forcing Sennacherib to retreat back to his homeland. Assyrian records show that, indeed, Sennacherib did not end up taking Jerusalem, or Hezekiah for that matter, but they, of course, don't give specific reasons for this. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Sennacherib was unsuccessful in his attempt to take Jerusalem. After his successful defense against Sennacherib, Hezekiah foolishly went on to show a Babylonian envoy the riches of his temple treasuries. Isaiah chastises him for this, due to the fact that, as we will see, Babylon would be no ally to Judah in the future. Sennacherib is ultimately forced to put down Merodach-Baladan again, and this time Sennacherib defeats him for good. Unfortunately for Sennacherib, though, he continues on to destroy Babylon, to the disdain of his own people, who had a degree of respect for the Babylonians and the holy city of Babylon itself. Sennacherib ends up being assassinated by two of his sons, and is succeeded by his third son, a man named Esarhaddon. Hezekiah in Judah is succeeded by his son Manasseh, who was an evil king, turning Judah back towards the idolatry that his father had worked so hard to destroy. He paid tribute to Esarhaddon, but would ultimately have an unfortunate interaction with Esarhaddon's successor. Esarhaddon's reign was known for battling with Egypt, but he also picked a fight with the so-called Medes from Media to the northeast of Assyria and Babylon. The Medes, essentially one of the predecessors of the Persian Empire, will become important shortly. Esarhaddon is ultimately replaced by a king in Assyria known as Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was successful in Egypt, bringing it under Assyrian control, but he was forced to deal with multiple rebellions throughout his realm. He was a strong king and was able to put these rebellions down, but these rebellions were an early sign of the coming downfall of the Assyrian Empire. Manasseh and Judah took part in the rebellion and was taken into captivity by Ashurbanipal after being defeated. Interestingly, after a couple years, Ashurbanipal released Manasseh back to his kingship, and Manasseh tried to repent and turn his people back to the true God of Israel, despite the fact that he was responsible for turning them away from the Lord in the first place. After Manasseh's death, he is replaced for a short time by an evil king in Judah named Amon, who was killed by his servants. Amon is replaced by a king named Josiah, who we will discuss more here momentarily. After Ashurbanipal's death, Assyria descended into a civil conflict between two of Ashurbanipal's sons. This allowed a man named Nabopolassar to gain control in Babylon to the south, which would ultimately spell the end for Assyria. However, before we get to Josiah in Judah and Nabopolassar in Babylon, we must pause and discuss Babylonian history leading up to this point as a refresher, because these civilizations will become important in the future of the kingdom of Judah. We remember that the old Babylonian Empire existed after the ancient civilizations of Sumer, Akkad, and Ur fell. Old Babylon, with its most famous king Hammurabi, fell when the Hittites to the northwest enacted a lightning raid that destroyed the empire during its down years. Babylon then came under control of a group called the Kassites for centuries, bringing forth a relatively quiet time in Babylon's history before being absorbed by the Assyrians after Assyria rises to prominence and breaks from the Mitanni. However, as rebellion and civil strife began to plague Assyria, especially after the death of Ashurbanipal, a man named Nabopolassar is able to consolidate control in Babylon, and he will end up becoming the first king of the so-called Neo or New Babylonian Empire. After Ashurbanipal's death in Assyria and the civil conflict that erupted between his two sons, one of his sons, named Sinsharishkin or Sarakus, was able to eventually consolidate control in Assyria after his brother was killed, but by this time it was too late. The wheels of destruction had already begun to turn for the Assyrians. Nabopolassar in Babylon had joined forces with the king of Media named Cyaxares, and they together marched on Ashur and Nineveh, capturing both cities and killing Sinsharishkin in the process. This, for all intents and purposes, was the end of the Assyrian Empire. It should be noted that the prophet Nahum was and had been prophesying at this time, and he had, along with the young prophet named Jeremiah, who we will get to shortly, actually predicted the downfall of Assyria and specifically the destruction of Nineveh. This is particularly interesting because when this prophecy was made, Assyria was still in a very powerful position, with Ashurbanipal having just defeated all of the rebellions that had been presented. Although the death of Sinsharishkin was basically the end of the Assyrian Empire, in reality one of the Assyrian army commanders, a man named Ashur-uballit II, technically Assyria's last king, tried to regroup and recover in order to make one last push in the name of the once powerful empire. He and parts of his army fled to Haran, the place where Abraham had traveled 2 centuries prior with his father. He will come up again shortly, albeit only briefly. The fall of Assyria at the hands of the Medians and the Babylonians happened during the kingship of Josiah in Judah. Josiah was a good king and did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He brought forth great reforms which destroyed the idol worship in Judah and brought back the celebration of the Passover, all while repairing the temple in Jerusalem as well. He was fortunate in that there was multiple important prophets during his time, including Zephaniah, probably the prophet who influenced him the most, Jeremiah, and then later in his reign, Habakkuk. Zephaniah advised Josiah on his reforms, and like prophets of days past, prophesied the coming destruction of Judah. Habakkuk would eventually prophesy the same, but there was always an indication that someday Israel would be restored to greatness, and this, of course, from a Christian perspective, is thought to refer not only to the return of Jews to Jerusalem, but also the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. Again, Jeremiah, another of the 4 major prophets we will discuss shortly. So here is where things get particularly interesting history-wise as a whole. During the reign of Ashurbanipal in Assyria, he had put, in essence, a puppet king in place in Egypt, Egypt being controlled by Assyria at this time. This brought forth the 26th dynasty of Egypt, the last native dynasty there, and the late period of Egypt began. This puppet king's name was Psamtik I, or Psammaticus. Psamtik was in power when the fall of Assyria began, but when he died, he was succeeded by his son, Necho II. After the fall of Ashur and Nineveh, the remnants of the Assyrians under the military commander, Ashur-uballit II, who had fled to Haran, appealed to Necho II of Egypt, who decided to march to aid the Assyrians in their last stand against Babylon. On his way to support the Assyrians in Haran, he passed by Judah, and for whatever reason, King Josiah decided to go out and confront Necho in the field at Megiddo. This was a bad idea. Necho defeats Josiah of Judah and kills him in the process. Necho then goes on to successfully defend the Assyrians against the Babylonians, still led technically at this time by Nabopolassar. However, soon Nabopolassar would begin to decline, and it would be his crown prince Nebuchadnezzar II that would ultimately bring glory to Babylon and destruction to Judah. After defending the Assyrians, Necho II returned to Egypt for a while, and on his way back to Egypt, he found that the Israelites in Judah had installed a new king named Jehoahaz, or Shalom. This was good King Josiah's 3rd son, and Necho deposed him and carried him off to Egypt in captivity for the rest of his life. Necho instead installed another son of Josiah, a man named Eliakim, Jehoahaz's elder brother, in his place as king, and renamed him Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim pays tribute to Necho II of Egypt, but eventually the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon leads a campaign to regain territory in Syria, and Necho II moves to confront him. Necho is defeated at the Battle of Carchemish by Nebuchadnezzar, and Jehoiakim in Judah then switches sides and begins paying tribute to the Babylonians. It is around this time that Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, dies in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar is forced to return to Babylon to claim his place on the throne. He takes, as evidence of his victories, hostages from Judah, including King Jehoiakim himself. Also included in this hostage group are people that are meant to be trained in the Babylonian ways and then reinstated back in Judah after they are re-educated. This included another of the 4 major prophets, Daniel, who will spend his days in Babylon. Daniel resists the temptations of Babylonian life and has many visions and interactions with the king. He will come up again shortly. After Nebuchadnezzar II secured his throne, Jehoiakim is sent back to Judah and resumes his kingship. He was an evil king who is well known for burning the prophet Jeremiah's scroll when he read something that he did not want to hear in the scroll. He also imprisons Jeremiah for a time. Nebuchadnezzar returns to Egypt to try and defeat them completely, but is halted by Necho II at the Battle of Migdol, forcing Nebuchadnezzar to return to Babylon to regroup. Jehoiakim in Judah, seeing this, chooses this time to rebel once again against the Babylonians with the support of Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar returns to the area, defeats a coalition arrayed against him, and lays siege to Jerusalem. Jehoiakim dies sometime around this time and is replaced by his son Jehoiachin, aka Jeconiah. Jehoiachin is only in power a short time before he is taken into captivity in Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, never to return to Judah. However, there are a few things to note here. First, Jehoiachin would eventually be released by a future king of Babylon and live the rest of his life relatively easy in Babylon. Second, the last of the 4 major prophets, Ezekiel, is commissioned, and he is taken to Babylon with Jehoiachin. He, along with Jeremiah, will prophesy to the exiles, and he will come up again shortly. Nebuchadnezzar, after deposing Jehoiachin, installs Jehoiachin's uncle, another son of good King Josiah, as king, and his name is Zedekiah, sometimes called Mattaniah. He, like his nephew Jehoiachin, is an evil king who was counseled by the prophet Jeremiah. Unfortunately, Zedekiah did not listen to Jeremiah. Jeremiah, like Isaiah, is one of the most important prophets in the Bible. His prophecies and life story as a whole is very interesting. Again, like many of his prophetic predecessors, he too prophesies the coming destruction of Judah as he speaks against the Israelites' idolatrous and evil ways. But Jeremiah is very specific in his prophecies. He predicts the destruction of the temple, which has stood since the days of Solomon, and the coming captivity of Judah to the Babylonians for 70 years. He prophesied Jehoahaz's captivity and death, who had been taken by Necho II, and predicts Zedekiah, the current king's, downfall as well. He, like other prophets, speaks of the redemption of Israel, and specifically of a righteous branch who will come from the house of David, who will bring forth a new and everlasting covenant with his people. Unfortunately for Jeremiah, he does not have a particularly happy life. He prophesies against false prophets in Judah who are claiming that peace will come upon the land. Jeremiah prophesies the exact opposite, and for this, King Zedekiah has him thrown into prison. He is pulled out by some who are angry that he is destroying morale in Judah and thrown into a cistern to die, but when Zedekiah hears of this, he has him pulled out and is returned to prison. Zedekiah unfortunately had major problems on his own hands by this point. He had been pushed by Necho II of Egypt's successor, Psamtik II, to rebel against Babylonian control, but he does not agree to this initially. However, once Psamtik II's successor, Apries, aka Hophra, comes to power in Egypt, Zedekiah is eventually convinced to rebel once again against Babylonian control. This would spell the end of the kingdom of Judah. The king of Babylon, still Nebuchadnezzar II, fed up with his troubles in Judah, leads a campaign to the area. After pushing back the Egyptians, he lays siege to Jerusalem once again, with Jerusalem falling and Zedekiah being captured. Jerusalem is sacked, the Temple of Solomon is destroyed, and the walls of the city are razed to the ground. The people of Judah are taken to Babylon to begin what is known as the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah, who is in prison when Jerusalem fell, is released and treated well by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. He is given an option to come to Babylon or to remain in the destroyed Jerusalem, with the remnants of the people who are left behind, which includes only the poorest of the poor. Jeremiah chooses to stay in Jerusalem, where he soon writes the book of Lamentations, writing of his lament of the destruction of his city. Jeremiah, along with Ezekiel, continue to prophesy to the Israelites in exile and urge them to settle down and live their lives as normally as they can, because the captivity will last for 70 years. Ezekiel had, of course, prophesied the destruction and captivity of Judah as well, but he also prophesied the coming destruction of Egypt, of Babylonia, and of Judah's surrounding neighbors. He also predicts that the temple that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar's army would be rebuilt. and that a shepherd king will someday gather his flock and rule in righteousness, truth, and justice. Jeremiah would end up being taken to Egypt against his will by the remnants of the Israelites in Judah, where he most likely died. Nebuchadnezzar returns to Babylon, where he has some interesting interactions with the prophet Daniel. However, after his death, there was a short succession of kings before the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to power in Babylon, Nabonidus. We remember that when Assyria had fallen, it was Babylon, along with Media, who were responsible for Assyria's destruction. The Babylonians and the Medes split up Assyria between the two of them after their victory, but there was an area, or a city rather, Haran, that was given to the Medes that Nabonidus, when he came to power, wanted. Thus he appealed to the grandson of the Median king at the time, a man named Cyrus, for assistance in attaining this territory. Cyrus, who would eventually be known as Cyrus II or Cyrus the Great, obliges, and in return is assisted by Nabonidus in attaining the Median throne. Cyrus, with Nabonidus' help, ultimately is able to overthrow his maternal grandfather, the Median king named Astyages, to seize control of Media. Cyrus was part Persian and part Median, and after he seized power, he effectively united these peoples into one empire and created the so-called Achaemenid Empire, aka the Persian Empire, in the process. Nabonidus didn't realize the tiger that he had just unleashed, nor did he realize that he would be the last king of Babylon. It wasn't long before Babylon itself came into disagreement with Cyrus, and the capable and well-liked Persian commander soon attacked the once powerful empire. Nabonidus had actually moved to the south for unknown reasons in a sort of self-imposed exile, and it was his son, a man named Belshazzar, who ruled in his absence in Babylon. The prophet Daniel has a particularly famous interaction with Belshazzar at a feast where a human hand begins writing on a wall. Although Belshazzar and his guests can read the words, no one can interpret the meaning of the writing at first. But Belshazzar calls for Daniel, who is still living in Babylon at this time, and he is able to decipher the message, saying that Babylon will soon be conquered by the Persians. Indeed, Cyrus, using incredible military tactics, does end up capturing Babylon, and Belshazzar is killed in the process. This effectively ends the Neo-Babylonian Empire, while bringing forth the ascendancy of what would become the Persian Empire. Cyrus, after taking Babylon, puts one of his generals in place to rule, while he focuses his efforts elsewhere. This man's name was Gobryas, and it is thought that the Bible refers to him as Darius the Mede. Cyrus was well known for being generally conciliatory to the people that he conquered, and after defeating Babylon, he met with and showed sympathy towards the Jewish population who were in exile there. In fact, he allowed the Jews to return to their homeland to begin the process of rebuilding their city of Jerusalem. He also agrees to allow the destroyed temple to be rebuilt. Although the Jews are able to return to Jerusalem and begin the process of rebuilding the temple, they are met with resistance by the people that had begun to populate Jerusalem in the years of exile. Furthermore, Cyrus was focused on other problems in his empire and co-ruled with his son and successor, a man named Cambyses II, for a time. Cambyses II did not show any favor towards the Jews, and thus the temple in Jerusalem was halted. It should be noted that the Bible most likely refers to Cambyses by a throne name, Xerxes, in the book of Ezra. This can be confusing because we will get to a king whose actual name was Xerxes in a moment. After his father Cyrus dies, Cambyses II becomes king of Persia, and the Jewish people in Jerusalem focus on building their own homes, leaving the temple and walls of Jerusalem unbuilt for 20 years. Cambyses is known for, other than killing his elder brother Smerdis, campaigning in Egypt and making the Egyptians despise the Persians during their control of the area. When he dies, he is replaced, most likely, by a man named Bardia, aka Gaumata, who masquerades as Cambyses' killed brother Smerdis. Gaumata is referred to in the book of Ezra as Artaxerxes, again confusing due to the fact that there is also an Artaxerxes that becomes king later. We must always keep in mind that these interpretations of who the Bible is referring to is disputed. Bardia is killed by a man named Darius, aka Darius I or Darius the Great, who becomes the next great king of Persia. He expands Persia significantly, which included moving west through Anatolia and across the Hellespont into what would be known today as Greece. He is famous in the Bible for reauthorizing the temple project in Jerusalem, which would be led by a man named Zerubbabel, an ancestor of Jesus. In fact, Zerubbabel would have most likely been the king in Jerusalem at the time had the monarchy of Judah not fallen, but he was nevertheless in a governor-type role, which allowed him to oversee the building of the new temple. It was during this time that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah were active in Jerusalem. In about 516 BC, the temple is completed, thus beginning what is known as the Second Temple period in Jerusalem. This temple will continue its normal function of daily sacrifices and worship all the way through the time of Jesus. Darius the Great would be focused in part towards the end of his reign with Greece, and it is here that we will pause once more and discuss a few brief points about Greek history leading up to this point. The earliest Greek culture was known as the Minoan culture, based out of the island of Crete. They were eventually conquered by a group called the Mycenaeans, who were based out of the Greek mainland. To put into perspective, the Mycenaeans were a group, generally speaking, that would have held power during the Trojan War and during the time of the Israelite judges. The Mycenaean civilization would be devastated by the Bronze Age collapse, which we remember was the time that the Sea Peoples moved throughout the Near East and made trouble for many other civilizations. Over time, a group called the Dorians would come to prominence in Greece, and generally speaking, Athens would become dominated by the Mycenaeans and/or the Ionian peoples, while the Dorians would form the civilization known today as Sparta. They would over time ally with each other, such was the case in the Greco-Persian Wars we will discuss briefly, and at times war with each other brutally, such was the case in the Peloponnesian War. Cyrus the Great at the beginning of his reign was focused in the west of Anatolia for some time before he turned his attention towards Babylon. His campaigns in the western part of Anatolia were designated to conquer an area called Ionia, which he did successfully in 540 BC. The Ionians, having a Greek background, eventually appealed to their Greek brethren in Athens for support against the Persians via the so-called Ionian Revolt, and this is where we get back to Darius the Great. The Ionian Revolt happened during the reign of Darius, and he was keen to put down the revolt and conquer Greece in the process. The revolt itself was put down, and Persia was successful in retaining Ionia for the time, but this revolt began something known as the Greco-Persian Wars that the Persians would not fare well in. Darius would be defeated at the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BC in his attempt to defeat all of the Greek mainland before dying a few years later. With this defeat, Greece begins to rise in prominence, which will ultimately culminate in them dominating much of the Near East, including what was once the kingdom of Judah and Israel. Darius is succeeded by his son Xerxes I, aka Xerxes the Great, who has an interesting story from a biblical viewpoint. Xerxes has become a more well-known figure in pop culture in recent years due to him being portrayed in modern media. Xerxes, like his father before him, tried to invade and conquer the Greek mainland, but was met with stiff resistance by the Greeks. His army defeated King Leonidas I of Sparta at the Battle of Thermopylae, which was later made famous by the movie 300. However, Xerxes, referred to as Ahasuerus in the Bible, would eventually be defeated and pushed from the Greek mainland. What many don't realize is that Xerxes was most likely the husband of Esther in the book of Esther. In short, Esther is chosen as Xerxes' queen, and she is able to uncover, expose, and thwart a plot to exterminate the Jewish peoples in Persian-controlled Israel using her connection to the Persian king. After Xerxes I dies, he is replaced by his son named Artaxerxes I. Artaxerxes inherited a large and unstable empire, and he was forced to deal with a revolt in Persian-controlled Egypt. The Egyptians, led by a rebel named Inaros II, appealed to a Greek League of Allies known as the Delian League for support. The Greeks, who were entering into a golden age after throwing off the influence of the Persians, were strong allies with the Egyptians. Artaxerxes sends a Jewish priest and scribe named Ezra, who was living in Persian Babylon at the time, to Jerusalem, so that Ezra could restore the proper worship practices that the Jews had lost since their subjugation and captivity. It is believed that Artaxerxes may have done this due to his desire to have a strong relationship with the Jews whose territory was on the road to Egypt. Indeed, Artaxerxes would put down the Egyptian revolt and retain his control of Egypt. However, the Greeks had since the time of Xerxes I continued to be a problem. The Persians, losing ground to the Greeks, were therefore forced to enter into a treaty known as the Peace of Calais, which essentially granted autonomy to Greek Ionia and other territories in return for an agreement of non-aggression from the Greeks. Nehemiah is also sent from Persia to Jerusalem around this time as well, and like Ezra, he is focused on rebuilding the city from the sorry state that it was in. While Ezra focused on the spiritual restoration of Israel, Nehemiah focused on the physical restoration of Israel and was instrumental in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. After Nehemiah returns to Persia and Ezra dies, the last prophet of the Old Testament, Malachi, comes about. He continues on to critique worship in Jerusalem, but he also speaks of a coming messenger who will prepare the way for the deliverer of the covenant. As the world enters into the 200 to 300 year intertestamental period, this period being the time between the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, Persian rulers come and go, and the Greeks fight their bloody Peloponnesian Wars. Ultimately, it would be a young general from Macedon that would conquer the Persians completely and lay the foundation of the world that would exist during the days of Jesus of Nazareth, Alexander the Great. Alexander defeats the last Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Arbela, leading to Alexander's possession of Persia and the destruction of the Persian Empire. After this defeat, Alexander and the Greeks became the unquestioned rulers of the Near East and acquired one of the largest empires in world history. Alexander controlled Greece, Anatolia, Persia, Egypt, the Levant region, including Jerusalem, as well as all of the areas of the former Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Alexander, convinced that his superior culture must be brought to the far-reaching ends and corners of his empire, began a process of spreading the Greek culture and language to everywhere he could. This process of spreading Greek culture today is referred to as Hellenization, Hellas or Hellenes being an ancient word for Greece or the Greek people. The time frame between Alexander's death and the rise of the Roman Empire would also be referred to as the Hellenistic period for the same reason, the Hellenistic period being when Greece was exerting its greatest influence on the world. This is important for reasons we already briefly touched on. With the spreading of the Greek language and culture, things began to change in the areas that Jesus would eventually inhabit. Greek became the lingua franca of the day, meaning that it was the language that many used as a common language, even if their own civilization spoke something different as their first language. So Greek during this time would have been like French was in the Middle Ages or English is today. In fact, Greek was spoken by people in Jesus' time, and the books of the New Testament would eventually all be written in Greek as well, although Jesus himself would speak Aramaic. The Hellenization of the Near East had an effect on Jewish lives as well, as some of the Jewish culture accepted a more Hellenistic view of religion, mixing in some Hellenistic beliefs and practices, while others rejected this. Over time, this split would lead to different sects within Jewish religious circles that would tangentially lead to some of the more well-known groups of people laid out in the New Testament, like the Sadducees and the Pharisees. This, of course, is a gross oversimplification, as initially there were simply groups opposed to Hellenization and others who were for it, like the Tobiads, for instance. We won't be discussing this in too much detail, but we will be talking more about the Pharisees, a conservative Jewish group that would play an important role in Jesus' life, in a moment. After Alexander the Great's premature death in 323 BC, his empire was divided by four of his leading generals. A man named Cassander took the west, a man named Antiochus took the north, a man named Seleucus took the east, and a man named Ptolemy took the south, which in essence meant Egypt. We will be focusing on two of these men, or rather, the kingdoms and empires that they formulated. Ptolemy taking over Egypt brought forth the Ptolemaic era in Egypt, which would be Egypt's last era of pharaohs. Seleucus, aka Seleucus I Nicator, in the east would form what would eventually become the Seleucid Empire, which would encompass much of Syria, north of Judea, and a vast empire to the east of Syria, including all of Mesopotamia. The Seleucids and the Ptolemaic Egyptians would fight 6 so-called Syrian wars between each other, with Judea being fought over as part of these wars. Ptolemy II captures Judea in the First Syrian War, but by the time that Ptolemy IV comes to power, he begins to oppress the Jews, which leads to Jewish resentment of the Egyptians. In the Fifth Syrian War, fortunes are reversed and Judea is captured by the Seleucids, who were led at the time by a man named Antiochus III, aka Antiochus the Great. He sends his daughter to marry the Egyptian pharaoh at the time, Ptolemy V, in hopes that this marriage would influence the Egyptian pharaoh towards a more positive relationship with the Seleucids. Her name is Cleopatra, and she will be the first of 7 Cleopatras that follow, with the 7th and final and most famous Cleopatra being the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra I was very young when she was married off to Ptolemy in Egypt, but her marriage did not have the effect that Antiochus III had hoped. Egypt would actually turn more towards a friendly relationship with the growing power to the northwest, this power, of course, being Rome. Antiochus III actually goes to war with Rome late in his reign and is defeated by the Romans, who are beginning to show themselves as a dominant force. After Antiochus III's death, one of his sons would eventually come to the Seleucid throne, who would be named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus IV is perhaps the worst foreign ruler that Judea ever had to deal with, and his interaction with the Jews in Israel would bring forth some interesting and contentious events. To start, he deposed the high priest in Jerusalem in order to place a more Hellenistic high priest in his place, while at the same time eventually putting in that position someone who was not a descendant of Aaron of the priestly tribe of Levi. Thus, he brings about the delegitimization of the priesthood in Jerusalem from a Jewish perspective, as all the high priests traditionally were able to trace their lineage back to Aaron. Worse yet were his actions against the Jewish people. After defeating the Egyptian pharaoh Ptolemy VI, his nephew, and keeping him as a puppet king, Antiochus IV is forced to retreat from Egypt in disgrace after Rome, who had treaties with Egypt, get involved in disputes in the region. Embarrassed and fearful of Rome's power, Antiochus heads back towards his homeland, but stops on the way in Jerusalem and takes out his anger on the Jewish population there. He plunders the temple, forces the name of the Israelite god to be changed to Zeus, forces sacrifices on the population, allows his soldiers to pillage the city, shuts down the temple for years, and martyrs thousands for their faith. This abuse brings forth an event known as the Maccabean Revolt, named for its aggressive leader Judas Maccabeus. The revolt utilized guerrilla-style tactics to harass the Seleucids at first, which would see Maccabeus win multiple battles and allow him to retake Jerusalem. Once retaking Jerusalem, he was able to purge and rededicate the temple there, and this is what the holiday of Hanukkah celebrates today in Jewish customs. Antiochus IV eventually dies, and civil conflict follows his death, with the Seleucid Empire seeing a steep decline soon after. Other powers like Rome, of course, continue to grow and expand. Judas Maccabeus, who was not particularly liked due to his hard-lined nature, eventually dies in battle, and his two brothers Jonathan and Simon are able to successfully negotiate Jewish independence with themselves as kings. Thus begins the so-called Hasmonean dynasty of kings around the year 140 BC. The Hasmonean kings begin to expand their territory to include the areas that are discussed in the New Testament during the life of Jesus. A king named John Hyrcanus absorbs Edom to the south and Samaria in the north. We remember that now we have Judea, or what was originally part of the kingdom of Judah, which included Jerusalem, who had remained somewhat ethnically Jewish. They were now under one roof again with Samaria, part of the former northern kingdom of Israel, who had had their Israelite population deported and resettled partially by the Assyrians. To add further complication, all of these, now fundamentally different, former Israelite and Judean territories had also been influenced, at least in part, by the Hellenization of the Greeks. So by this time, there were Jewish sects of religious circles who did not agree on everything religiously, and in fact, many of these different groups detested one another. Another Hasmonean king, Aristobulus, adds the territory of Galilee to his holdings, thus bringing into the Hasmonean kingdom the place where Jesus would be from. Despite Judas Maccabeus' opposition to Hellenization, and Hellenization being part of the reason that the Hasmoneans revolted in the first place, subsequent rulers of the Hasmonean dynasty were much more open to Hellenistic Judaism. The ones who fought against this Hellenization and tried to remain true to the teachings of the one true God of Israel were none other than the Pharisees. At this point, despite how poorly the Pharisees would be viewed during the time of Jesus, the Pharisees were the protagonists of the story, and they were hated and persecuted by some of the Hasmonean kings. Rome, by this time, was entering into a militaristic and imperial age. They had gone through their kingdom and republic era and were ready to take their next steps into their age of empire. The famous general Gnaeus Pompey and the Romans, after winning victory over the kingdom of Pontus and the Seleucids in the Mithridatic Wars, annexed Syria into Roman holdings. Pompey, traveling near the area of Jerusalem, eventually finds that Jerusalem is under siege due to the fact that there were two competing Hasmonean kings vying for power. Pompey sides with one of them, a man named John Hyrcanus II, in return for loyalty to Rome, and it is at this point that Judea comes under Roman control around the year 63 BC. Hyrcanus, who had been ousted by his opponent before Roman intervention, was reinstated, not as king but as high priest. A few years later, the first triumvirate is formed in Rome between Pompey, Julius Caesar, and a man named Crassus. Julius Caesar becomes consul and fights the Gallic Wars in the north in modern-day France. However, he and Pompey drift apart, and Pompey becomes a champion of the Senate who fear the power of Julius Caesar. Civil war breaks out after Julius Caesar famously crosses the Rubicon after denying Senate demands. Around this time, a man named Antipater the Idumean, an official of John Hyrcanus, becomes the governor of Judea after supporting Julius Caesar in his conflict. He sends one of his sons to oversee the region of Galilee in the north, and this son's name was Herod. Neither of these men, Herod or Antipater, were part of the Hasmonean dynasty, but they will be the first in the line of kings known as the Herodian or Herodian dynasty. They derive their lineage from Idumea, which was another name for the territory of Edom south of Jerusalem, Edom being the descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. Pompey is eventually defeated by Julius Caesar and assassinated by the pharaoh in Egypt, Ptolemy XIII, after Pompey fled there for refuge after his defeat. Julius Caesar, despite the conflict with Pompey, did not want his assassination, and he was outraged by the actions of Ptolemy XIII. Caesar deposes Ptolemy and installed his sister, who he had been warring with, Cleopatra VII, as pharaoh. Again, we remember that she would be the last pharaoh of Egypt, and she carried on a famous affair with Julius Caesar after. Julius Caesar returns to Rome and is famously assassinated by the Roman Senate. Antipater the Idumean in Israel suffers the same fate, being killed about a year later, at which point his son, Herod, takes over control in the confusion. He will go on to become Herod the Great, one of the most famous Herodian kings in the New Testament. A second triumvirate is formed in Rome between Julius Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, a general named Mark Antony, and a general named Lepidus. They run out the conspirators that were responsible for Julius Caesar's assassination and divide Rome between the three of them, with Mark Antony taking the east, which includes Egypt. Herod, who supported the triumvirate, is confirmed in his position by the Romans. However, a Hasmonean prince named Antigonus, with the help of the Parthians, Parthia being an area to the east of Judea, whose people hate Rome and control parts of the former Seleucid Empire, force out Herod from his position in Jerusalem. Herod, after his defeat, appeals to the Romans, who make him king of the Jews and assist him in retaking Jerusalem. Like the first triumvirate, the second triumvirate eventually disintegrates as well and brings forth another civil conflict. In both cases, it ends up being a one-on-one situation, as one of the three members of the triumvirates doesn't play a part in the conflict. Crassus of the first triumvirate died fighting the Parthians. Similarly, Lepidus of the second triumvirate falls from power and essentially retires. Thus, Octavian and Mark Antony duke it out, with Octavian coming out on top after defeating Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. Mark Antony and his lover, Cleopatra VII, famously commit suicide after Antony's defeat. Although Herod in Jerusalem supported Mark Antony, he appeals to Octavian to remain in his seat of power. Octavian confirms him, but Herod begins to show signs of paranoia and begins killing people close to him. He kills his brother-in-law, some of his wives, and many of his sons. This is important because Herod will ultimately be responsible for an event during Jesus' life called the Massacre of the Innocents, which we will get to shortly. It should also be noted that Herod was an avid builder and was a fan of colossal building projects. One of his major projects was the update and expansion of the temple in Jerusalem, which was lavishly improved upon by Herod during his time. This incredible structure will end up being the temple that Jesus travels to during his life and prophesies the destruction of. Octavian, after his victory, becomes the first emperor of Rome, Augustus Caesar, and Rome enters its imperial age. With Augustus as emperor and Herod as king in Jerusalem, the stage was finally set for the coming of a man who would single-handedly change the course of history in its entirety forever. We begin the story of the worldly life of Jesus of Nazareth with an angel named Gabriel. Gabriel travels to a man named Zechariah, who is married to a woman named Elizabeth, and tells him that, due to the couple's righteousness, they would conceive a child and name him John. This seemed unlikely due to the fact that Zechariah and Elizabeth were older, and Elizabeth was considered barren, but just as the angel had said, Elizabeth did indeed conceive a child, and he would eventually be named John. The child was to be filled with the Holy Spirit, and was to pave the way for the Lord to come. He, of course, would be known to history as John the Baptist. Gabriel the angel also travels to Galilee, north of Jerusalem, to a town called Nazareth, where he meets with one of Elizabeth's relatives, a woman named Mary. Gabriel tells Mary that despite her virginity, she will conceive a child that is to be named Jesus, who will take over the throne of King David and rule over the people of Jacob forever. Mary, after understanding that the Holy Spirit will come over her for this to happen, accepts the task righteously and prepares for whatever the Lord requires of her. She, however, is betrothed to a man named Joseph, and when he finds out that she is with child, he, knowing that he had not had any sexual relations with her, decides to leave her quietly. But an angel of the Lord comes to him in a dream and reassures him that he should continue with his planned marriage to Mary due to the fact that Mary has conceived by the Holy Spirit. Joseph is also instructed to name the baby Jesus by the angel as well. With Mary's conception of Jesus, the prophecy that Isaiah spoke 600 to 700 years prior is realized. Quote, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Mary, pregnant with Jesus, visits her relative Elizabeth, pregnant with John, and when Elizabeth hears Mary speak, the baby, John, was said to have leaped in her womb. Elizabeth gives birth to John the Baptist not long after this interaction. We remember that Octavian had won in his battles with Mark Antony and had become Augustus Caesar. Augustus orders a census to be taken through a man named Quirinius, who would eventually become Roman governor of Syria. It was intended that all were to be registered in their own town, and since Joseph was from the tribe of Judah and was from the town of Bethlehem, he takes his heavily pregnant wife from the town they live in, Nazareth in Galilee, to Bethlehem in Judea. So we must pause here to discuss a point of contention. The most famous census by Quirinius, the Syrian governor, was done in 6 AD, which would have been when a man named Coponius was the prefect of Judah. This has brought forth a dating problem, although I must add here that we will discuss Coponius and the leaders of Judea and the surrounding areas in a moment. Jesus was actually born around the year 4 to 6 BC, and the Bible indicates that Herod the Great, the paranoid builder king, was still alive at the time of Jesus' birth. However, it is believed that Herod died before the famous census of Quirinius, and if the famous census of Quirinius happened around 6 AD and Jesus was born in 6 or 4 BC, then this seemingly brings forth a contradiction on when Jesus was born. There have been many who have reconciled or attempted to reconcile this issue, and I will put forth one reconciliation here. Quirinius and Coponius were thought to have been involved in Judea well before they held their titles that they are known for today. There is a possibility that some form of census was taken of Herod the Great's holdings prior to his death, as he was getting old and it would be beneficial to know what was included in his lands. Therefore, Quirinius and Coponius may have been involved in the administration of a census separate from the famous one attested to in 6 AD during the time of Herod the Great and prior to them taking on their respective roles in Syria and Judah. This, of course, is disputed, but nevertheless, when dealing with ancient history, it's difficult to pinpoint exact time frames. As Joseph and Mary reached Bethlehem in Judea, they found that there was no room at the inn, and thus the couple were forced to shelter in a cave or stable that was used for animals. Mary went into labor and gave birth to Jesus, who was famously placed in a manger after his birth. Thus, the prophecy of Micah 5:2 was realized. Quote, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days." Jesus is circumcised in accordance with Jewish customs, and shepherds in the surrounding fields are notified by an angel of the Lord that a Savior has been born. They leave their fields and travel to see and worship Jesus. After a certain amount of time, up to 2 years possibly, a group of so-called wise men or kings travel from the east to Jerusalem, seeking the King of the Jews after seeing a star rise. These men are also referred to as the Magi. Herod, who knows the prophecy of Micah perfectly well, is troubled when he hears of the wise men's travel intentions. In his mind, he, not Jesus, is the King of the Jews. Therefore, he asks the wise men to report back when they find the child, so that he may travel and worship him himself. Herod, of course, has no intention of doing such a thing, and in fact wishes to kill Jesus if he has a chance. The wise men travel to Bethlehem and find Jesus, at which point They worship him and bring forth their now famous gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. However, the wise men are warned in a dream not to return to Herod in Jerusalem, and so they do not. When Herod finds out that the wise men have fooled him, he is enraged. His paranoid state and heartless indifference towards bloodshed compels him to put out an edict that all male children in the area, 2 years and under, are to be killed, an event known today as the Massacre of the Innocents. An angel of the Lord again appears to Joseph in a dream and instructs him to leave for Egypt due to Herod's intentions to kill Jesus. Joseph, listening to the angel's commands, packs up his wife Mary and Jesus and travels to Egypt for safety. Herod, despite his desire to kill Jesus in the last years of his life, is unsuccessful, and he dies around the year 4 AD. Now that it was safe to travel back to the area, Joseph is again instructed to travel back to his homeland. However, he is instructed not to travel back to Judea, but rather to head back to the town of Nazareth in the northern territory of Galilee. This is due to the fact that Herod's son, Herod Archelaus, is reigning in Jerusalem at this time, and it is at this point that we must break for a moment in order to discuss history yet again. Despite the fact that Herod the Great killed many of his family members, including some of his sons, he still had multiple sons alive after his death. When Herod died, his realm was split up into a so-called tetrarchy, meaning that it was split up into 4 different areas. 3 of his sons, Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Herod Philip II, all received territory after their father's death. Of course, as we have already briefly touched on, Herod Archelaus inherited Judea from his father, which included Jerusalem and Bethlehem. He is actually made ethnarch, not king, and becomes detested by all. He does a poor job in ruling Jerusalem, and so Augustus Caesar removes him from his position in 6 AD and replaces him with a so-called prefect, Coponius, who we also just touched on previously. Archelaus' removal from Judea would have been in the same year that the famous Census of Quirinius took place. Coponius would be the first in a line of prefects in Judah, which were eventually changed to procurators over time. And this line of prefects would include the famous Pontius Pilate, who we will discuss in more detail later. Another of Herod the Great's sons, Herod Antipas, inherited the region of Galilee, which included the town of Nazareth, where Jesus and his family traveled to after their return from Egypt. Herod Antipas will come up again in a major way later in Jesus' story. The other 2 tetrarchs who inherited Herod the Great's lands were another of Herod's sons, Herod Philip II, and his sister Salome, who are not particularly important to the discussion. Although Herod Archelaus was initially the only one who lost direct control of his territory to Rome, eventually all of these regions would come under direct jurisdiction of the Romans, although at different times. At this point, Jesus begins to grow, and this time of his life is relatively obscure. One event that is well attested to took place when he was about 12 years old. Jesus, along with his mother Mary, Joseph, and others traveled to Galilee from Jerusalem for the Passover holiday. After the event had happened, the group of people traveled back to Galilee, and Mary and Joseph assumed that Jesus was somewhere in their traveling band. They were mortified when they eventually found out that indeed he was not with the group, and so they traveled back to Jerusalem, where they found Jesus in the temple, listening, asking questions, and discussing in detail with the priests of the temple, the scriptures, and the overall Jewish beliefs in general. Jesus returns with Mary and Joseph to Nazareth, where he grows into a man. The story of Jesus' life as a public figure and a man begins with a person we touched on previously, John the Baptist, who we remember was one of Jesus' relatives. John had been living in the wilderness and had been preaching to the people that the kingdom of heaven was at hand. He had begun baptizing people in the Jordan River in the area of Perea to the east of Judea, hence his name. He claims that this baptism wipes away one's sins and transgressions against God, and there were many from all around, including Jerusalem, who traveled to see him. However, John made it clear that he may be baptizing with water, but there would be one who would follow him, who would baptize with the Holy Spirit. He, of course, was referring to his relative Jesus, who was about to begin his ministry. Thus, John was paving the way for Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, and thus the prophecy of the prophet Isaiah was realized. Isaiah 43, quote, "A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." It should be noted that I'm touching on a few of the major prophecies that were realized through Jesus, but please understand that, again, from a Christian perspective, Jesus fulfilled hundreds of prophecies. Although in the modern day many accept Jesus' background and messianic message as harmonious, many in the Jewish world during his time believed that the person who would come in the form of the Messiah to free them from the bonds of their presumed Roman overlords would be a powerful warrior king. As we will see, Jesus of Nazareth would not be what most had expected the Messiah to be. Jesus travels to John the Baptist in Perea to be baptized by him, and although John protests that it should be Jesus baptizing him, Jesus assures John that he should indeed baptize him. John does, and it was said that the heavens opened up and the Spirit of God descended on Jesus. By the time that John the Baptist baptized Jesus, Augustus Caesar had been dead for some time, and he had been succeeded as emperor by his less than enthusiastic stepson Tiberius. Tiberius would play virtually no role in the life of Jesus and his ministry, but it is interesting to note that he was emperor in Rome while the things we are about to discuss are taking place. Additionally, after Coponius, the Roman prefect or governor over Judea, 3 more prefects came and went, till around the year 26, when a man named Pontius Pilate had taken over the role. Here is a list of all of the Roman prefect/procurators through 66 AD, which will be as far as we track them. We can see that Pontius Pilate was the 5th prefect on the list, and he will become an important character in the life of Jesus, as we will see. It should be noted that some, but not all, others on this list will be discussed in time. Jesus, after his baptism, is led into the wilderness by the Spirit, at which point he is tempted by the devil Satan. After fasting for 40 days and 40 nights and being tempted by Satan with food, protection, proof, and power, Jesus rebukes Satan using the scriptures and defeats the temptations. As a refresher, we remember that Satan, from a Christian perspective, was a fallen angel who rebelled against God and was cast down to earth after his rebellion. He, in essence, envied the Lord's power and wished to have this type of power for himself. He, in a way, is the origin of evil. Adam and Eve, of course, were tempted by the serpent in the Garden of Eden at the beginning of time, and the serpent is, or is meant to represent, Satan. Humans, by their own free will, chose to partake in the sin that the devil proposed. So despite Satan being the original source of evil in a way, humans' free will to choose this sin is what brought forth the issue of the so-called original sin, which is the idea that all humans were born with a sin nature after the fall of Adam and Eve, and that the guilt of this sin is passed on to all who come after, with the exception of Jesus. The reason this is important is because the temptation of Jesus by Satan is meant to show that Jesus experienced the same type of temptations that all humans experience, and he was able to defeat the temptation of Satan completely and live a perfectly sinless life. Jesus, again from a Christian perspective, has 2 natures. He is fully human and fully divine. Although he is one person, his 2 natures cannot be split. Again, this is another point of contention for certain denominations. This can be a difficult thing to understand, so we won't spend too much time on it, but the point I'm trying to drive home here is that the human nature of Jesus experienced what any other human on earth experiences from a temptation standpoint, and he overcame this temptation. After his baptism in Perea and his temptation, which took place in part in Judea, Jesus travels back to the region of Galilee in the north and attends a wedding in a town called Cana. It is here that Jesus, despite not officially beginning his ministry yet, performs his first miracle. Jesus, who was invited by his mother Mary, was notified by his mother that the wedding was about to run out of wine. This would have been a big taboo in those days, and so Jesus turned 6 jars of water into fine wine for the celebration. Not only was he able to do this, but the patrons of the party commented on how fine the wine seemed to be. Shortly after this, Jesus returns to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration, and he cleanses the temple there for the first time. The temple had been corrupted by people selling animals and making money, and Jesus, using a whip of cords, overturned the tables of money changers, poured out their coins, and drove them from the temple. This would not be the last time that Jesus would do this. The Jews in attendance asked him why or by what authority he was doing these things, and Jesus responded saying, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it." He was referring to himself as the temple, but the Jews did not understand what he meant and took his words at face value, thinking that he was saying that if the massive temple in Jerusalem were destroyed, he himself could raise it up in 3 days. This becomes an important piece of information later in Jesus' story. Around this time, while Jesus was in Jerusalem, he met with a man named Nicodemus, who was a Pharisee and a member of the so-called Sanhedrin. Now, we remember that the Pharisees, were a conservative denomination within Judaism who had stood up bravely to the Hellenization efforts of some of the Hasmonean kings and had paid a serious price for doing so. Although it has been debated, many believe that Jesus himself was most likely part of the Pharisaic tradition. By the time that Jesus was born and had grown to the point that he was ready to begin his ministry, the Pharisees had become somewhat corrupted and had turned into legalistic, hypocritical gatekeepers of the faith. As we will see, despite the Pharisees' honorable and distinguished past, the Pharisees will become a serious and dangerous opponent to Jesus. The Sanhedrin, in short, was a council of distinguished elders and priests who oversaw the maintenance of the faith in practice and law. They kind of acted like a supreme court and made decisions as to whether someone was guilty of things like blasphemy or other offenses. From a Jewish religious perspective, they were a very powerful group of people. They were not all Pharisees, however, as other Jewish sects like the Sadducees were part of this council as well. The Sanhedrin will come up again at the end of Jesus' story. Jesus' meeting with Nicodemus is important in that he relays to Nicodemus important ideas that were foreign to Jews at the time, specifically the idea that someone must be, quote, born again in order to see the kingdom of God. Jesus, of course, was not meaning that one must literally be born again physically. Instead, he meant that one must receive the Spirit of God and be changed internally and morally from that point on. It is during this conversation that Jesus spoke perhaps the most famous and most quoted words of the Bible, John 3:16, which states, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." Nicodemus was still perplexed by Jesus' teaching, and this would become a common theme as we will see. Although many Christian lessons are so well known and widely accepted today, in Jesus' time, his teachings were hot off the press and new to his listeners. Thus, there was often confusion by those who were listening to him, as many often took the things that Jesus said literally, when in fact his words were not always meant to be taken that way. Jesus often taught in parables, and many times used analogies to make his points. He could also be cryptic at times, which, even to this day, leads to debate on some of the true meaning of his words. By the time Jesus had completed his task at the Temple of Jerusalem, he had followers or disciples that began to follow him. Jesus is particularly famous for calling 12 disciples, aka apostles, to be his main group of followers who helped him with his ministry. Whether or not he had called some of these disciples by this time is unclear, but he certainly had followers with him by this time. After his interactions in Jerusalem, he remained in the Judean countryside baptizing people through his disciples that were with him by this point. Once finished here, Jesus returns to Galilee, but along the way, he was forced to go through Samaria. We remember that Samaria, loosely speaking, was the area that constituted the former kingdom of Israel. After it had been defeated by the Assyrians had repopulated the area with pagan peoples. Thus, this area over time developed into a mix of people, both ethnically and religiously, and due to this, there tended to be tension between Samaria and the surrounding regions. In fact, many times people would choose to go around Samaria rather than travel through it because of the hostility they might encounter. Jesus, while traveling through Samaria, stops at a place known as Jacob's Well, referring to a well that was owned by the patriarch Jacob in the days of old. While there, his famous interaction with the, quote, woman at the well took place, where Jesus' disciples traveled to find food for the group, and a Samaritan woman came to gather water from the well while Jesus rested near it. Jesus, while speaking to the woman, asks for a drink, at which point the woman, surprised that a Jew was asking for water from a Samaritan, asks him why he is doing so. Jesus replies that if she knew who she was talking to, she would have asked him for a drink, and he would have given her living water. Jesus goes on to tell the woman all about her past, and she realizes who she's dealing with, that being the Messiah. She leaves her water jar and goes to the people of Samaria, spreading the word of her experience. Other Samaritans come out and marvel and invite Jesus to stay with them, which he does for a couple days before continuing his journey to Galilee. Word had begun to travel about Jesus of Nazareth, and certain Jews, i.e. the Pharisees, and the religious powers that be, i.e. the scribes and priests, had begun to listen to stories about Jesus with suspicion. After Jesus had healed an official's son in Galilee, some time passes, and Jesus returns to Jerusalem in Judea for the Passover once again. Here, on the Sabbath, he heals a cripple at the so-called Pool of Bethesda, and many Jews were angered when they heard that Jesus had done such a thing due to the fact that he healed someone on the Sabbath. Doing things like this were forbidden on this day in Jewish customs. Even by this time, already, there were those who were seeking to kill Jesus, not only due to the fact that he was doing things like healing on the Sabbath, but also, and perhaps more importantly, due to the fact that he was stating that God was his Father. It is important here to pause for a moment and discuss a doctrine in Christianity known as the Trinity to give a bit of context for anyone who may not be familiar with it. The Christian doctrine of the Trinity, in essence and in short, is the idea that God has revealed himself to humans in three distinct but not separable forms: God the Father, God the Son, aka Jesus Christ, and God the Holy Spirit. All three of these persons are one in that they are all God. However, they are distinct from each other. The Son is not the Father is not the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is not the Son, but they all together comprise of God. This is why Jesus is considered and often called the Son of God, while being considered God at the same time. The point of, or importance of, Jesus having both a non-separable, fully divine and fully human nature is so that he is able to bridge the gap between humanity and divinity, and as we will see, his actions will show why this is so important from a Christian perspective. Jesus leaves Jerusalem and returns to Galilee, but he soon finds out that his relative John the Baptist has been arrested by Herod Antipas. We remember that Herod Antipas was a son of Herod the Great, who ruled over the region of Galilee. One of his brothers, Herod Philip, had married a woman named Herodias, but she divorced him and went on to marry his brother Herod Antipas. John the Baptist spoke out publicly against this marriage as it was unlawful and immoral. This is why John was arrested. However, Herod Antipas did not execute John for the time being, as he was fearful of the prophetic popularity John had established with many people in the region. John the Baptist and Herod Antipas will come up again shortly. Jesus, upon returning to Galilee, travels to his hometown of Nazareth. It is here that Jesus begins his ministry officially. He, as was custom in his time, was chosen to stand up in the synagogue and read the scriptures to those in attendance. However, after reading the scroll, he returns it to the attendant and begins to speak of himself in divine terms as the Jewish Messiah and as a fulfillment of the scriptures. The people of Nazareth, who had seen Jesus grow up as the son of a carpenter, were dumbfounded and outraged by his claims and were not willing to believe what he said. Jesus had performed miracles, and this was known, and so the people of Nazareth required him to perform miracles in their own town, but Jesus would not. Additionally, we must remember the idea that the Messiah would be a carpenter's son who came from a dingy little poor town like Nazareth was counter to this idea that many had that the Messiah would be some great warrior king that would save the Jewish people from oppression. Thus, the people in Jesus' hometown, weak in their faith, ultimately reject Jesus and drive him from the temple, taking him to a cliff so that they may throw him to his death for committing blasphemy. They ultimately did not follow through with this, and Jesus was able to escape, but nevertheless, it was clear that the road moving forward was going to be a difficult one for Jesus. So it is here that we are going to discuss and give an expedited account of Jesus' official ministry in no particular order, and we begin with the discussion of the 12 disciples that Jesus chose. Again, Jesus had other followers besides the 12 disciples, such as that of Mary Magdalene, a woman who was one of Jesus' earlier followers who Jesus had cast demons out of, but the 12 disciples were his closest and most trusted inner circle of followers, some of which would go on to play important roles in the future of the early Christian church. The names of Jesus' 12 disciples were Simon, aka Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Nathanael, aka Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, sometimes called Levi, James, sometimes called James the Lesser to distinguish him from the other James, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas. Simon Peter and Andrew were brothers, and Andrew had been a follower of John the Baptist, where he had initially learned about Jesus. James and John were brothers. Philip had also been a follower of John the Baptist and was a friend of Nathanael. Matthew was a tax collector, a very detested profession in that day. Simon the Zealot was part of an aggressive nationalist Jewish political movement known as the Zealots, whose purpose was to drive the Romans out of Judea. And Judas, who controlled the finances, will eventually not be a disciple for reasons we will soon discuss. The most famous calling of any of these disciples was probably the calling of Simon Peter, his brother Andrew, and James and John, who were all fishermen in a town called Capernaum, which was located on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus spent a lot of time in Capernaum and did many things in Capernaum as part of his ministry. The calling of Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John, in short, goes something like this. Simon Peter and Andrew were out fishing on the Sea of Galilee one day and were having no luck. When they returned to shore, Jesus asks Peter if he could use his boat to elevate himself so that he could preach to the people following him. Simon and Andrew oblige, and after Jesus is finished, he instructs the men to throw their nets out again. Despite their reservations due to their lack of success previously, they listen to Jesus and are overwhelmed by the large amount of fish that they're able to catch in this moment. Jesus famously tells them to follow him, and he would make them fishers of men. Simon, Peter, Andrew, and ultimately James and John, who were fishing partners with Simon, Peter, and Andrew, leave all they have to follow Jesus. We will not be touching on the calling of other disciples, but it is important to note that Simon Peter will be a leader in many ways and plays a particularly important role many times in the dealings of the disciples or interactions with Jesus. Certain Christian faiths take Peter's important role very seriously, the Roman Catholics specifically, who believe that Peter would go on to become the first pope. But again, that starts to get into the realm of apologetics, so we will not be expanding on this. Jesus conducts the vast majority of his ministry in the northern region of Galilee and spends much time on and or around the sea there. However, he did at times travel to other regions as well, such as the Decapolis, Phoenicia, Perea, and of course Samaria and Judea. He went through 3 separate circuits in Galilee, where he traveled to different towns and areas, healing people, performing miracles, and spreading his teachings to all who would listen. Here is a non-exhaustive list of some of the things that Jesus did physically in the form of healing and miracles during his ministry in Galilee and surrounding areas. Jesus healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law, who was gravely ill at the time Jesus and Peter met. He healed paralytics who had been unable to walk their entire life. He healed the sick, dying, and or deceased children, the most famous of which was the daughter of a synagogue leader named Jairus, whose daughter had died but who Jesus was able to bring back to life. He healed a woman who had chronic menstrual bleeding, which, as we remember when discussing the Jewish cleansing rules from the Mosaic Law, made her in a state of constant uncleanliness, in essence, an outcast. Jesus often healed mentally ill or possessed people, casting out the demons who controlled or tormented them. He healed extreme physical ailments at the time, like leprosy. He was able to heal the blind, the deaf, the mute, and any other physical ailment that one could think of, like withered limbs. Indeed, people traveled from far and wide to see him, not only to be healed in some cases, but also to hear his message. There are a few particularly well-known miracles that Jesus performed during his active ministry, the first 2 of which took place after Jesus learned of the death of John the Baptist. John, we remember, had been imprisoned by Herod Antipas for speaking out against Herod's marriage to his brother's former wife. Herod's wife, Herodias, developed a hatred of John after this, and after Herod stated that he would give Herodias' daughter anything she wished after she performed marvelously for Herod, Herodias convinced her daughter to ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod, feeling bound to the oath he had just made to his stepdaughter, ordered the beheading of John the Baptist, which was carried out. Jesus, after learning of this, was greatly troubled, and he and his disciples, who were exhausted from their work, traveled to a remote area on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This did not prevent people from finding them, however, and gathering to where they were. Jesus' fame had grown exponentially, and there were many who sought him out for reasons we already touched on. As the crowd began to grow, Jesus' disciples became concerned for the well-being of the crowd, which numbered over 5,000, as they were in a remote area. They were concerned that there was not enough food to feed all of the people in attendance. To the surprise of the disciples, Jesus simply commands them to feed the people themselves. Taken aback, they indicate that they only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus blesses the food, and miraculously, the food was multiplied so that all 5,000 people in attendance could eat. This would not be the only time he did this. In fact, later on in his ministry, he fed a crowd of 4,000 in a similar way. Jesus sent the disciples across the sea as he dismissed the crowd and went up on the mountain to pray. During the disciples' crossing, they encountered a violent storm which threatened to harm or kill those on board. Previously, the disciples had actually experienced something similar while Jesus was sleeping in the same boat as them. However, when Jesus had been awoken, he was able to calm the storm with his hands. This time, however, Jesus was not with the disciples on the boat, and they feared greatly for their lives. But as they thrashed about among the waves, the disciples saw what they believed initially to be a ghost approaching them across the water. In fact, it was Jesus who was walking on the water towards them. Peter, who wants to verify Jesus' identity, asks Jesus to allow him to walk on water, and indeed, Jesus calls him out onto the water with him, where Peter initially has success, but begins to sink after his faith weakens. Peter is of course saved by Jesus, and the storm is eventually calmed by him as well. But Peter's experience on the water was an important exercise that shows that Jesus was able to use his powers through other people. In fact, at one point, the 12 disciples themselves were sent out by Jesus 2 by 2 through the countryside, spreading the word and healing in his name. Thus, it was not only Jesus who was performing these incredible acts of healing, as his disciples did this at times as well. The other miracle that Jesus performed that is particularly famous came towards the end of his life. While traveling from Jerusalem through the area of Perea, where John the Baptist had ministered when he was alive, Jesus heard the family members of a man named Lazarus discussing that Lazarus was gravely ill and back in Judea where Jesus had just left from. Jesus eventually travels to Judea and finds that Lazarus had died 4 days prior to his arrival. The Jews did not embalm, and so after 4 days, Lazarus' body, which had been placed in a tomb, would have been in a state of decomposition. Nevertheless, after hearing the distraught cries of Lazarus' family, he commands that the tomb be opened and that Lazarus come out of the tomb. Lazarus is revived and walks out of the tomb alive and well. All of these healings and miracles brought forth a great increase in popularity and love from some, but it also brought forth great anger and detestation from others. Much of this anger and detestation came from the Jews who were often referred to as Pharisees, which included the Pharisaic religious leaders who had power at that time. Since we have touched on some of the physical aspects of Jesus' ministry, it is also important to discuss a few of his important teachings as well to give context to what the religious leaders and devout Jews were angry with and opposing. Although the things Jesus taught were relayed throughout the duration of his ministry, he has one particularly famous event where he goes through some of his more famous teachings in detail, and this took place early in his ministry. This is referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. Here is a non-exhaustive list of some of the things that Jesus taught in no particular order. Jesus preached that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, and that it was important that people repent and turn from their sinful ways. He taught that one should be righteous, merciful, pure in heart, and a peacemaker, and taught that those who believe in his message must share it with others. He warns about anger, lust or sexual immorality, divorce, retaliation, judging others, and idolizing earthly treasures. He taught that you must love your enemies. He warned that those who follow him will be persecuted, and that one should rejoice in this persecution, because those who are persecuted for following him will find favor with God. He reiterated that he did not come to abolish or change the law of the prophets in the Old Testament, but to fulfill them or reiterate them. He warned that one should not openly practice his faith so as to gain attention, for instance, by giving to the needy for public fame and praise. He taught that one should not be anxious about being sustained in life, what you eat, where you live, and what you will wear, because the Lord will provide for you. He warned about judging others, and states that one should do unto others as they wish to have done to them. He warned to beware of false prophets, the so-called wolf in sheep's clothing, and that one can judge any prophet or teacher by their fruits, i.e., how well they carry themselves with regard to the commandments. He taught that no one was worthy of heaven, except him, of course, and that some who do good things will come expecting heaven or everlasting life because they believe that their works were righteous enough. But in reality, many of those people will be turned away because no amount of good deeds or actions is enough to offset one's sins or sin nature. Instead, it is only through faith in him and the sacrifice that he will make that one could be saved. He warns that those who do not repent will be destroyed, and that those who blaspheme against the Holy Spirit cannot be saved, and that those who have accepted him show this by their good actions and lifestyle. He countered and challenged many of the traditional legalistic Jewish teachings at the time. For instance, many Jewish customs or laws prevented someone from eating certain things lest they be considered unclean and have to go through a cleansing ritual. He taught that it wasn't what one put into one's mouth that made them unclean, but rather what came out of their mouth in the form of words that made them unclean. He warned that one must humble themselves like a child, and that those who do this will be seen as the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He taught people that it is okay, or rather proper, to listen and to obey the authority of those in power politically, as long as they are still able to do the will of the Lord. He taught that after he is gone, he will come again one day, and that no one knows when that day will be. When this day comes, everyone will be resurrected and judged according to their faith and actions. Everyone will be either given access to eternal life in heaven or will be eternally punished in hell. Most importantly, he taught that he was the Son of God, and that although the wages of sin were death, He would be the one who would take on the burden of this guilt for all who believe in him and his message. Of course, today, in a world that has been so fundamentally influenced by Christianity, this for many is common knowledge and nothing new. But in Jesus' time, his message was extremely contentious, and no one had heard of some of these things. So the question that has to be put forward is, what was it that the so-called scribes and Pharisees were criticizing and condemning him for? Why did they hate Jesus' teaching so much, and why were they plotting to kill him? There are many reasons why Jesus was hated, but here's a list of some things that made some people, the scribes and Pharisees, particularly angry. They were not happy that Jesus received and dined with sinners and detested people, like Matthew the tax collector. They were not happy that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and in fact, they tried to say for some time that Jesus was casting out demons in the name of Satan. Jesus, of course, used basic common sense to rebuke them, as it makes no sense that Satan would cast Satan out of people. They were not happy that Jesus and his disciples ate on the Sabbath, which again was against the rules at the time. They were not happy that Jesus claims to forgive sins, when in their mind only God can forgive sins, and they did not believe that Jesus was God or the Messiah. They were not happy that Jesus and his disciples didn't always wash properly according to their customs, hands, pots, etc. They were certainly not happy with Jesus' popularity, and as his fame grew, the hatred towards him grew as well. They were not happy that Jesus criticized them by calling them hypocrites and pointing out their misdeeds and need for public praise. They were angered by the fact that any time they tried to trap him in his words or refute what he was saying, he was always able to outwit them intellectually and force them to back down publicly in a debate-type setting. They took great offense to the fact that he said that they could destroy the magnificent and massive temple in Jerusalem and that he could rebuild it in 3 days. Again, Jesus was referring to his body as the temple, but they took this literally, and they will use this against him later, as we will see. Lastly, and most importantly, they hated that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, which they believed was blasphemy in its purest form. As Jesus continues to minister and his fame continues to grow, the powers that be in the religious high places come to the conclusion that his teachings will lead to problems with the Roman authorities, and this could lead to the destruction of the Jewish nation as a whole. Therefore, they determined that, in their mind, it would be better that one Jew die than for an entire nation of Jews to suffer and die, so they begin to plot to take his life by whatever means necessary. We will now walk through the events towards the end of Jesus' ministry leading up to and including his death. Jesus knows that the end of his life is nearing and begins to prepare those around him for what to expect. He foretells his death to his disciples, who are distraught and or angered and try to convince him that there must be a way to prevent this. Jesus will end up foretelling his death to his disciples multiple times, but he also speaks about the fact that on the third day he will be resurrected. Interestingly, the disciples are confused by exactly what Jesus means by this. Around this time, Jesus takes Peter and the brothers James and John and leads them to a mountain where his face and clothes begin to shine brightly like the sun. While there, Moses and the prophet Elijah appear and speak with Jesus while the 3 disciples watch in amazement. A bright cloud comes about and overshadows them all, and a voice from the cloud claims that Jesus was his son with whom he was well pleased. This event is referred to as the Transfiguration, which took place in the region of the Decapolis. Shortly after this, Jesus travels back to Jerusalem in Judea to attend the Feast of Tabernacles, a pilgrimage holiday for the Jewish people. He sends his disciples before him and travels in private. While there, he teaches in the temple and has contentious interactions with the Jews there. Although there are some there who wish to give Jesus a fair chance, specifically Nicodemus of the Sanhedrin, most who Jesus interacts with are hostile to his preaching here. It is here that Jesus utters the famous phrase that many quote regularly to this day, while trying to explain to the Jews how he, a man not yet of 50 years of age, has seen the patriarch Abraham. He states what is written in John 8:58. Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. This was a clear indication of his divinity and of the fact that he was claiming to have been eternal like his Father. The Jews around him, worked up into a fury, attempt to stone him on the spot, but Jesus is able to slip away. By this time, as we recall, there were many who wanted Jesus dead, including the religious leaders of the Sanhedrin. Jesus is, in essence, a fugitive, and although he travels back to Galilee for a time, he eventually makes his way to Jerusalem for the last time. It is around this time that Lazarus is raised from the dead, which we touched on previously. As Jesus approaches Jerusalem, he sends his disciples to fetch a donkey and her colt, and he rides into Jerusalem on this donkey colt, to the praises of many around him, waving palm branches in celebration of his so-called triumphant entry. This is the origin of Palm Sunday, the palms representing victory or triumph, and this event fulfills the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9, which states, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The whole city is stirred by his entry, and everyone begins to know that this person is Jesus of Nazareth. Indeed, many believed that Jesus had come to forcefully exert his will against the Roman authorities, in accordance with how many viewed the Messiah in that day. Little did they know that he had come to exert his will against a much more powerful enemy, an enemy of evil, and that he was coming to save them in ways that they could never understand at the time. Jesus travels to the temple and cleanses it a second time, similarly to the way he had cleansed it the first time. The scribes and the Pharisees continue to disbelieve Jesus' claims and continue to grow in their hatred towards him, but they refrain from doing anything for the time being. After lodging for the night at Bethany, Jesus returns to the temple and is confronted by the scribes and priests, who again ask by what authority he is doing the things that he is doing. Although the scribes and Pharisees continually try and trap Jesus theologically, hoping that he would say something that they could have a gotcha moment with him, Jesus defends and defeats them intellectually and socially over and over again, to the point that they just give up questioning him altogether. Again, although the scribes and priests technically sit in the seat of Moses and have some authority because of this, Jesus calls out their hypocrisy in that many in these positions make worship difficult for honest followers of God, while they don't adhere to the principles they preach. Jesus goes on, while the disciples are commenting on the size and splendor of the temple, to prophesy that this great temple would soon be destroyed, and that Jerusalem in itself would be hemmed in on all sides and destroyed as well. The Passover holiday was approaching, and the chief priests and the elders were at this point about to discover their way to succeed in their plots against Jesus. At Bethany, just outside Jerusalem, Jesus is anointed by a woman who has an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. The disciples object to this because of the expensive nature of the oil, but Jesus rebukes them and tells them that what the woman is doing is good and that she is anointing him for his death. It is here that things begin to set in motion the final chapter of Jesus' life on earth. One of the 12 disciples, Judas Iscariot, decides that he will betray Jesus and deliver him to the high priests and scribes for 30 silver coins. On the evening of the Passover, Jesus meets with his disciples in an upper room in Jerusalem, and one of the most iconic events in Christian history takes place, the so-called Last Supper. Here, Jesus breaks bread and distributes wine to his disciples and institutes a new covenant with them, a covenant which is made through him. The bread represents his body, the wine his blood, which will soon be shed so that the sins of man can be forgiven. Jesus commands that the disciples do this in remembrance of him. This, along with baptism, will ultimately become one of the so-called sacraments of the Christian church, in essence, something that people can do regularly to partake in and prove their faith. This is another topic that can be particularly contentious within Christian circles, as some Christians take a more literal meaning to the idea of the bread and wine being flesh and blood, while others see this as being purely symbolic. Regardless, all true Christians to this day practice receiving bread and wine as part of their services or masses in remembrance of this event, and in order to follow the instructions that Jesus commanded them to do. The Last Supper took place on the eve of Passover, and we remember that the Passover was an event in which a lamb without blemish was sacrificed, and its blood placed above the doorways of the Israelites who were in captivity in Egypt during the time of Moses, to avoid the final plague that killed all of the eldest sons in the area. The blood of the lamb without blemish saved those in Egypt who listened to God. Jesus now was set to become the new lamb without blemish, who would be sacrificed so that his blood would, like the blood of the lamb during the Passover, save those who listened to God. Jesus, at the Last Supper, indicates that one of his disciples will betray him, which of course brings forth consternation within the group. Nevertheless, Judas, corrupted by greed, continues on with his plan. After this, Jesus teaches that soon his flock will be dispersed, and Simon Peter emphatically protests to Jesus that he will never leave his side. Jesus, in a famous exchange, tells Peter that not only is this not true, but that before the rooster crows, Peter will have denied ever knowing Jesus 3 times. Jesus then goes on to teach the disciples that he will send the Holy Spirit after he departs, another person of the Holy Trinity we discussed earlier, to guide the disciples in their faith moving forward. We must remember that although Jesus had told the disciples that he would defeat death and rise again in 3 days, none of them were able to comprehend exactly what he meant by this. They were soon to find out. Jesus soon travels to the Garden of Gethsemane, a garden of olive trees, with some disciples, Peter, James, and John, and commands them to sit while he prays. Jesus becomes distraught at his coming persecution and knows the torture and suffering he will soon be enduring. Just as any other fully human man would, he anguishes over the thought of what he must go through and asks God the Father to relieve him of this coming suffering if there is any possible way. But alas, there is no other way. He then finds the disciples sleeping 2 times and goes away a second and third time to pray, asking again if it is possible that he can escape his coming torture. An angel appears to him, which gives him strength, and he begins to sweat blood which falls to the ground. Jesus then wakes the disciples as Judas, with an angry crowd from the chief priests and elders in tow, approaches with soldiers to arrest Jesus. Judas had already told the crowd that he would kiss Jesus in order to single out who he was. After Judas greets Jesus, he plants on Jesus' cheek the kiss of betrayal, at which point Jesus is seized by the soldiers. One of Jesus' disciples, probably Peter, uses a sword and cuts off one of the soldiers' ears. Jesus heals the man's ear and rebukes the disciple before being led away. Jesus is brought forth to a few people at this point: Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, a council, and the high priest Caiaphas himself, who was part of the Sanhedrin, again the Sanhedrin being the religious governing body of the Jews in that time. Simon Peter follows Jesus at a distance. False witnesses are brought forth to make false claims against Jesus, and some bring up the fact that Jesus had said that he could destroy and rebuild the temple in 3 days. Jesus, effectively now on trial by the Sanhedrin, is asked by the council for a response, but Jesus remains silent. They ask him directly if he is the Christ, aka the Messiah, and Jesus answers them effectively in the affirmative, at which point blasphemy is declared and Jesus is found guilty. The council deems that death is warranted, and they begin to mistreat Jesus immediately by spitting on, slapping, and striking him. There were some in the Sanhedrin, specifically a man named Joseph of Arimathea, and presumably Nicodemus, who objected to this, but Jesus was still nevertheless found guilty. However, these 2 dissenting men will come up again shortly. Simon Peter, standing just outside the court, is recognized 3 times and questioned as to whether he was a disciple of Jesus the Galilean. Just as Jesus had predicted, Peter denies that he ever knew Jesus 3 times, at which point the rooster crows. Peter is immediately stricken with grief over his inability to stand up for his rabbi. Jesus is bound and delivered by the chief priests and scribes to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, where he is accused by the Jews of influencing people to follow him as king instead of Caesar. Judas, finally realizing the gravity of his actions, attempts to return the 30 pieces of silver before leaving to commit suicide. Pontius Pilate questions Jesus, asking him if he was the king of the Jews. Jesus gave no real response other than claiming that his kingdom was not of this world. Pilate, somewhat perplexed, sends Jesus to Herod Antipas after learning that Jesus was a Galilean and Herod Antipas was still the tetrarch over this region. Herod was happy to have Jesus sent to him due to the fact that he had heard much about him and his miracles. But when Jesus would not perform these miracles for Herod on demand, Herod mocks Jesus, dresses him in fine clothing, and sends him back to Pontius Pilate. Based on an existing tradition at the time, Pilate was able to release one prisoner of the Jews back to them, and sensing that Jesus' condemnation was probably a consequence of the actions of a few angry high priests who did not represent the will of the people at large, Pilate offers to release Jesus. However, the crowd that had gathered by this time had been worked up into a frenzy by the chief priests and the scribes, and they chose to release a notorious murderer named Barabbas instead of Jesus. Pontius Pilate, again, not finding anything in Jesus warranting death, offers to simply punish Jesus to satisfy the crowd, at which point he would release him. The crowd refuses this, and in a fury, screams for Jesus to be crucified. Pilate, possibly fearing some form of uprising if he declines, Jerusalem and Judea was known for being a difficult province to rule, feels that his hands have been cleansed of the blood of Jesus. The Jews in attendance agree that the blood of Jesus will be on their hands. Thus, Jesus is condemned to death by crucifixion, and he is led away. Many of Jesus' female followers, including his mother, follow Jesus as he's led away by the Roman soldiers and stripped. He is put in a scarlet robe, and a crown of thorns is forcibly pushed into his scalp before the soldiers mock him by kneeling in front of him and calling him the King of the Jews. Jesus is then scourged mercilessly before he is led away to his cross, which he is forced to carry through the streets to the place of his execution, which was just outside the city and called Golgotha. Today, Christians refer to this place as Calvary. Jesus, along the way, struggling to carry his heavy cross after already experiencing such vicious abuse, is assisted by a man named Simon, who had been compelled by the Roman soldiers to help Jesus. When they reach Golgotha, outside the city, Jesus is stripped and brutally crucified by the Roman soldiers. He is crucified along with two criminals, one to his right and one to his left, and while this is happening, Jesus begs for forgiveness of those engaged in the crucifixion, saying the famous phrase, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The three crosses are erected so that Jesus and the criminals hang in agony, while passerbys deride and mock them. The priests and scribes mock him, saying that if he is the Christ, he should save himself. The Roman soldiers cast lots for Jesus' clothing, and a sign is hung above the suffering Jesus which reads, "King of the Jews." One of the thieves crucified with Jesus criticizes him and orders him to save them if he is who he says he is, but he is rebuked by the other thief on the other cross, who declares that Jesus is innocent. This thief then asks that Jesus remember him when he enters into his kingdom. Jesus replies to this man, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." As Jesus struggled and suffered on the cross for hours, with his own mother watching in despair, he cried out the famous words in agony, "Father, Father, why have you forsaken me?" The sky begins to darken, and although he has refused sour wine previously, he begins to thirst. A sponge was held to his mouth, and after he had received some, he spoke his final words, "It is finished," before giving up his spirit. Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, and the Jewish Messiah, was dead. Immediately the earth quakes, rocks split, and awe sets in from the soldiers involved in the execution. With the Sabbath approaching the following day, some were keen on expediting the death of those on the cross, so the bodies would not remain there on the day of Sabbath. Therefore, the Roman soldiers begin to break the legs of the two criminals crucified with Jesus in order to hasten their deaths. When they came to Jesus, they realized he was already dead and thus decided to simply spear him in his side. The two members of the Sanhedrin who had objected to Jesus' treatment in his trial, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, request permission from Pontius Pilate to take Jesus' body down for burial. Pontius Pilate, surprised that Jesus had died so quickly, agrees, and the two take Jesus' body. After wrapping the body and preparing it according to the customs of the day, the two place the body of Jesus in a rock-cut tomb and roll a large rock in front of his entrance before departing. Some of the chief priests and Pharisees, remembering now that Jesus had said that after 3 days he would rise, are concerned that Jesus' body will be removed from the tomb by his disciples, at which point his disciples could claim that Jesus had risen. Therefore, they request that Pilate station soldiers to guard the tomb until after the third day, and Pilate agrees to this. After the Sabbath passes, Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' followers, travels with other women to the tomb of Jesus. When she arrives, she sees that the tomb is open, that Jesus is gone, and that there is an angel or angels that have told her that Jesus has risen. As certain disciples are informed and hurry to the tomb to see the proof for themselves, Jesus begins to appear to his followers in the flesh, many of whom do not recognize him. He appears to many over the next 40 days in Judea and Galilee, sometimes appearing to one disciple or to one person, sometimes appearing to all the disciples or a portion of the disciples, and sometimes appearing to crowds as large as 500. In his resurrection, Jesus has conquered death and the forces of evil, and had taken control of earth since the fall of Adam and Eve, and he made this known to all he encountered. The disciple Thomas becomes famously skeptical of these sightings after not being involved in some of them. He states that he will believe that Jesus has risen only when he can see the marks of the nails in his hands and put his fingers into the holes of the nails. Soon Jesus appears to all the disciples with Thomas present, and he is unsurprisingly convinced. He would eventually develop the descriptive nickname Doubting Thomas after this interaction. Jesus says to Thomas after this interaction, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." knowing full well that many future generations of people will not have the opportunity to see him in the flesh in their earthly lifetime as the disciples had. Jesus' last interaction on earth took place in Jerusalem, where he instructs the disciples to go and spread his word to the world, and that he will be with them until the end of the age. The disciples follow him to Bethany, at which point he raises his hands and blesses them one final time. He then departs them and is carried up into heaven to take his place at the right hand of the Father. Now, some might think that this is where the story of Jesus ends, but in fact, his life on earth was only the beginning. Jesus' disciples begin to spread Jesus' teachings at great risk to themselves, thus officially beginning the spread of the Christian universal church that Jesus had established prior to his death. In fact, many of these disciples would become martyrs for their faith, suffering persecution and horrific executions by the powers that be, and the fact that many were willing to go through this type of suffering indicates to many that what they were saying was true. If there was anyone who could have 100% known that Jesus of Nazareth was a fake, it would have been his closest disciples. It is true that many people over the centuries have chosen to die for a cause that is false due to their beliefs, but these people go to their deaths never really knowing if the things they believe are true because they have never fully experienced firsthand the things that they believe in. This was not the case for the disciples. If they had been collectively spreading a lie about Jesus' divinity, they would have certainly known this. No one knowingly submits themselves to the types of persecution and ghastly execution that some of the disciples went through, knowing full well that what they were saying was a lie. Thus, many take this as strong evidence that what the disciples were saying, again, was true. A short time after Jesus' death, the Holy Spirit was sent and came upon the disciples, as Jesus said would happen, and this gave the disciples special gifts or charisms to be able to communicate. They were suddenly able to speak in tongues foreign to them, which allowed them to spread the gospel of Jesus to foreign lands and people. This event is known today as Pentecost, and the so-called Pentecostal or charismatic Christian denominations who claim to be able to speak in tongues derived their theology and name from this event. Eventually, it was soon realized that Jesus' offering of forgiveness through his sacrifice was not only meant for Jews, and in fact, it was required of the disciples to begin to preach to the Gentiles, this is a non-Jewish person, as well. Again, we can see now with the fuller picture the distinction between the Jews of the modern day and the Christians, and that their beliefs diverge significantly from this point on. Interestingly, it would be a Jewish man who was vehemently opposed to the idea of Jesus being the Messiah that would have one of the largest impacts on the early development of the Christian church. He was actually involved in the martyrdom of the first Christian martyr, a man many know now as Saint Stephen, and his name was Paul, aka Saul of Tarsus. After Stephen's execution by stoning, Paul was traveling back to Damascus when he was confronted by Jesus, who spoke to him through a shining light in the clouds. Paul, being rebuked by Jesus for his persecution of Christians, was immediately converted, and he became, in essence, the greatest traveling salesman that the Christian faith has ever seen. Although he did not interact with Jesus directly on earth, he worked with and interacted regularly with people who did, and he would become one of Christianity's most famous saints. A writer of many of the books of the Bible, Paul traveled throughout the neighboring regions at great risk to himself, and after setting up churches in cities, he would often leave and then advise them in their matters of faith and practice through letters. He traveled to and communicated with Christians in these various cities, including cities like Ephesus. His letters to the church in Ephesus, the people there being referred to as Ephesians, eventually become a canonical book of the Bible, the book of Ephesians. Similarly, his letters to the church in Rome become the book of Romans, Thessalonica, books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Galatia, book of Galatians, Corinth, book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippi, book of Philippians, etc., etc. He also had companions and other followers of Jesus who traveled with him at times, and he wrote letters to them as well, which is where we get the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. We end the story of Jesus with the history that led to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which Jesus had so famously foretold when he lived. After Emperor Tiberius died in 37 AD, a few years after Jesus was crucified, he was replaced by Emperor Caligula, who by all standards was a very deviant ruler. He had become friends with a man named Herod Agrippa I, a grandson of Herod the Great and nephew of Herod Antipas, who was still ruling over Galilee at the time. Herod Antipas is deposed by Emperor Caligula, and Antipas's nephew, Herod Agrippa I, is made king of regions surrounding Judea. But once Caligula is assassinated and replaced by his uncle Claudius, Herod Agrippa I inherits Judea as well, along with some other surrounding territories, essentially bringing into his control all that his grandfather Herod the Great had controlled. During this time, the Apostle Paul is traveling to different cities mentioned earlier, which is most likely when some of his letters are being written. Claudius is eventually poisoned by his wife so that her son Nero can become emperor, and with Nero, things begin to go badly for the Christians. Nero was notoriously demented and unstable, and by the time he had come to power, Christians were becoming a well-known group of people in Rome. The Christians were blamed for the fire in Rome in 64 AD, and thus they began to be persecuted terribly. They had already experienced a degree of persecution from the Jews prior to this, but being persecuted by Rome was a different type of persecution. Nero was famously said to have used Christians as human torches to light his gardens at night. Although Christians will be persecuted many more times in the next couple hundred years, this first Neronian persecution of Christians is important because it is most likely when the Apostle Peter and Paul are killed. Paul causes a riot in Jerusalem, and he is forced to give a defense, which is laid out in the book of Acts, to Herod Agrippa II, Paul appealing to Caesar because he is a Roman citizen. By this time, Herod Agrippa I had died, and his son, Agrippa II, had taken over control of his territories for a time. Herod Agrippa II would be the last Herodian ruler of Judea, for reasons we will touch on shortly. Paul would eventually meet his end, as would Peter, on the back end of Nero's reign. He was thought to have been beheaded, while it is believed that Peter was crucified upside down. By this time in Judea, the Roman prefects, or procurators, had become incredibly corrupted, and this mixed with growing tension in Judea between those who were pro-Roman and those who were anti-Roman led to disaster. We return to the list of Roman prefects and procurators of Judea to see that during the reign of Nero, there were 4 procurators that came into power. Antonius Felix was said to have been a very corrupt individual who had actually had an interaction with Paul in the New Testament, and he was sacked by Nero and replaced by a man named Porcius Festus. Festus was actually somewhat liked, but he was not able to quell the growing opposition to Rome at that time, and he died prematurely. He was replaced for a short time by Lucius Albinus, but ultimately a man named Gessius Florus took over control in Judea. By this time, the growing opposition to Rome and its corruption had allowed more radical groups to grow in support, one of which being the Zealots, who we remember were a nationalistic, anti-Roman sect of aggressive Jews. We also remember that one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot himself. These Jews were calling for a violent revolution against Rome, and after Gessius Florus stole from the temple treasury and executed many Jewish citizens, this revolution was attempted. Open rebellion broke out in the year 66 AD, beginning the so-called First Jewish-Roman War. Herod Agrippa II fled from Judea at this time, never to return, thus ending the Herodian dynasty of kings. A Roman military force was dispatched to take control of the situation and defeat the Jews, but they are surprisingly and embarrassingly defeated by zealot resistance at the Battle of Beth Horon, where thousands of Roman soldiers are killed. For a time, the radicals take over control in Jerusalem, but they cannot get along and begin to infight. The Christians in Jerusalem, who knew perfectly well Jesus' prophecy that Jerusalem and its temple would be destroyed, fled from the city. In fact, Jesus, when he was alive, had warned the people to do just that when they saw armies outside of Jerusalem's wall. For those who fled, it was a wise decision. Nero appoints a very well-respected military leader named Vespasian to travel to the area and crush the rebellion. He travels to the area from the north, brutally putting down the rebellion in Galilee before setting his sights on Jerusalem. Interestingly, Vespasian is forced to leave his son Titus in command to finish up putting down the revolt due to the fact that Emperor Nero had been forced to commit suicide, which brought forth the so-called Year of the Four Emperors, and Vespasian decides to try and take the imperial throne for himself. Vespasian is ultimately successful in pushing his claims to the imperial throne and became emperor in 69 AD, bringing forth the Flavian dynasty in Rome. Less than 1 year later, in 70 AD, Vespasian's son Titus, who would in time become emperor in his own right, laid siege to Jerusalem. Eventually, faced with the might of Roman power and vicious infighting between the Jews, Jerusalem unsurprisingly fell. The city was destroyed, and just as Jesus had foretold, the temple that once stood so beautifully and imposingly was razed to the ground, bringing a stunning and brutal end to a temple that has never since been rebuilt. The life of Jesus of Nazareth, as laid out in the New Testament Gospels, is an incredible story to read, whether one believes the claims of Jesus and events in his life or not. There is little doubt that Jesus was a real person, a human man that existed in time, and indeed, his life is more attested to than some more famous figures in ancient history. The impact of his life and ministry was so monumental, so astonishingly extensive and far-reaching, that much of the very basis of the moralistic side of our cultural world that we know today has its roots in his life and teachings. From the development of academia and science to the founding of many Western countries in the modern day, Christianity has played a pivotal role in shaping the world we know and has given many design, purpose, strength, and goals with which to aspire to and strive for. It certainly can't be denied that many with devious, conceited, and/or ignorant designs have attempted to hijack the moral rules and teachings of Jesus in order to make them better fit into a worldview more accommodating to their ideals. But at a very foundational level, it is clear that most of these people don't realize that the morality that they often preach or try to adhere to, if boiled down, originates from God and the teachings of Jesus. What is right, what is wrong, what has value or who has value, and why this value exists, what is evil and why is it bad. These are existential questions that people encounter every day, whether they know it or not, and many have pointed to the fact that it is only through God and Jesus that we can have an objective basis or standard with which to determine morality, to determine what is right and wrong, to determine what is good and what is evil. Although we were not focused on Jesus' morality as much in this video, these issues are specifically why the story of Jesus is so important and needs to be discussed. As I stated at the beginning of this video, I'm not here to convince you as a viewer either way to believe or disbelieve the events or teachings of Jesus Christ's life, but I am here to briefly and informally spread the knowledge of what it was that took place during his life, why the events leading up to his life and death as laid out in the Old Testament are important and interesting, and how these events are part of a larger picture of history that is not strictly biblical in nature. The Bible is not just some book of fairy tales and mythical parables, and does not strictly relay moral teaching through and through. There is real history and real people who took part in real events in this book, and I hope that I was able to reasonably relay this to anyone watching today. Of course, there are a couple thousand years of church history between us and Jesus of Nazareth, and this history is just as compelling and interesting as the history we touched on here today. But alas, for now, this history will have to wait until another video. Christians today know and believe that Jesus will return, that he is not dead, that he lives on in eternity with the Father, in his teachings through the church, and in the calling of the Holy Spirit, which is extended to all. Whether this claim is true or not is up to you to decide. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Cheers.